In this course, we'll take a deep dive into CSS Grid, which allows us to create true, responsive, two-dimensional grid layouts using pure CSS, and I'll show you how to use it to create advanced layouts in your production sites today. We'll start with a crash course in the CSS Grid layout module specification, so you get your bearings. Next, we'll discuss some best practices for planning and executing CSS Grid layouts in production. And then, we'll dive headfirst into advanced layouts with CSS Grid, covering full bleed layouts, multi-column layouts, card layouts, nested layouts, and even interactive off-canvas menus. The CSS Grid layout module changes pretty much everything about web layouts and opens the door to new and unexplored territory. CSS Grid is a core CSS layout module, just like block, inline, flex, table, and so on. So if you're familiar with these traditional layout modules, you're pretty much ready to go in this course. To follow along, you need a solid understanding of semantic, accessible HTML and CSS, as well as some basic JavaScript. I'll be using Atom as my code editor and previewing my content in the browser with the Atom Live Server package. For this course, I'm using Firefox as my browser, and you can follow along using any code editor and any modern browser, though at the moment I recommend Firefox because of its enhanced layout features. You'll see more about this a little later on. CSS Grid introduces some new terminology, so to give you a leg up as you get started with this new layout module, I've created a handout explaining in plain language the most common terminology for CSS Grid for your reference. The handout is in the exercise files under the Assets folder, and you can either keep it on your computer for reference or print it out. So, open the file, and let's take a quick look at the basic concepts of CSS Grid. First off, grid container. A grid container is any element with its display property set to grid. In a single view or a single document in the browser, you can have as few or as many grid containers as you like, and you can also nest grid containers inside other grid containers. This is what we'll cover throughout this course. The direct first-level descendant elements of a grid container become grid items. These are automatically placed on the grid unless you specify otherwise, and you can also precisely place each grid item inside the grid exactly where you want it to appear. It's important to note that just like with Flexbox, only first-level descendants of a grid container are placed on the grid. Children of these descendants are not affected by the grid at all. The grid container has 4 grid lines out of the box, the outer edges of the grid. You would typically add additional rows and columns using row and column lines to segment the grid into cells. Grid lines are referenced by number, starting and ending with the outer edges of the grid container, so the left and top edges are typically counted as line 1, and then each line is given an incremental number. CSS Grid honors the text direction of the current document or even current element, so in left to right settings, the left outer edge is line 1, and the last line is the right outer edge. And in right to left settings, the numbering is reversed, starting with the right outer edge as line 1 and then ending with the left outer edge. You can refer to a grid line by its number, or you can give grid lines custom names and then refer to them by their custom names. We'll cover that a little later on. A grid cell is the space between 2 adjacent horizontal and vertical lines where a grid column and grid row intersect. So pretty much exactly the same as a table cell. A grid track is the space between 2 or more adjacent grid lines, either horizontal or vertical. Row tracks are horizontal, column tracks are vertical. A grid area covers 1 or more cells, and the purpose of a grid area is to define an area within the grid that can be referred to when grid items are placed. Finally, grid lines have no width by default, meaning each grid track is jammed up against the next one. You can add space between each grid track by adding a grid gap. The grid gap creates uniform gutters between each track, and you can choose to define a column gap, a row gap, or a gap for both columns and rows. Just remember, when you use grid track, you're effectively creating empty space between each grid track. And that in turn means whatever color or item is appearing behind your grid will now shine through this grid gap. That gives you a quick overview of the general terminology we'll use throughout the rest of the course, and now you're ready to start building your first grid. This chapter is dedicated to introducing you to the inner workings of CSS Grid. For that purpose, I've created this prototype web document you see in my browser right now. It has a series of containers with different background colors and some basic text content, and each container is tagged with a class name so it's easy to identify what container we're currently working with. You'll find this prototype in the exercise files for this movie, and to follow along, open the exercise files in your preferred code editor. I'm using Atom with the Atom Live Server package running, and boot up index.html in Firefox. Why Firefox, you ask? Well, right now, Firefox is the browser with the best developer tools for CSS Grid. You'll see what I mean as we move forward. Now, this is all brand new stuff, so I'm actually recording this in a beta version of Firefox called Firefox Nightly. That's why you see there's a dark banner here at the top. But by the time you watch this course, the features I'll show you here should be available in regular old Firefox proper. Looking at the HTML for this document, you'll see we have a body with a class site that holds a series of first-level descendants with classes like skiplink and masthead and page title and main content and so on. In the browser, these elements show up one after the other as individual blocks, which is exactly how it should be. Now I want to use CSS Grid to experiment with different layouts for these boxes. The first step is to declare a grid container, and in this case, the container is the body element with the class site up here, because that's the one that contains all these other items. So just to keep concerns separated, I'm going to create a new file here, call it stylegrid.css. Then I'll call it in from index.html. So I'll just copy this stuff out, and then style sheet, style grid. And then inside style grid, I'll declare site. You'll remember that's the site container. And then just say display. That's all. Save. Go back in the browser. And everything looks exactly the same, which is exactly what should happen because although we've defined a grid, the grid only contains one cell, which is the entire grid container. But here's the cool part. If I now go into the developer tools by inspecting any element here, and then select this body element with a class site, you'll see over here on the right-hand side, it says site. This is the rule we created. Display, grid, and then you have this little kind of waffly pattern next to it. And if you click on that, you toggle on the grid visualizer. And now when we look at the grid here, you'll see there's an outline here, which is the grid itself. And then you'll notice that each of the items, so this is item, this is an item, this is an item, they're actually placed in individual grid cells. It's just right now, those grid cells happen to be vertically aligned and stacked one after the other. So effectively, it doesn't make any difference. We can now click over to the Layout tab on the right-hand side here, and you'll see it tells us under Grid, we have an overlay grid for body site that's currently toggled on. We can toggle it on and off. And inside this tool, we can now choose exactly what we want to see visualized. So I can extend grid lines infinitely. You can see here, the grid lines are now extended beyond the grid container itself. So here you're starting to see those grid lines I talked about. You can display line numbers, and they'll appear up here. So here we have line number 1, line number 2, line number 3, and so on. Now, of course, we currently don't have any columns, so we just have line 1 and line 2 for columns. And finally, we can display grid areas, but we don't have any grid areas yet, so there's no point toggling that on. This tool also allows me to see which grid areas I'm currently focusing on by simply hovering inside this display. And as we start creating more complex grids, you'll notice this is tremendously helpful for seeing exactly what is going on in your grid and focusing on the elements you want to focus on. With a grid container defined, we can start declaring grid lines to create columns and rows. This is done using the grid template columns and grid template rows properties. Each of these properties takes lists of values separated by spaces that set the column or row width or height by declaring the width or height of the space between one line and the next one. Let me show you what I mean. In the browser right now, the grid has one column that spans the full width of the grid, with column grid line 1 being the left edge and column grid line 2 being the right edge. To split this space here inside the grid into two equal width columns, I'll go to my CSS and declare grid template columns, and then say 50% and 50%. Save that, and in the browser, you now see we have an additional grid line. So we have grid line 1, the left edge, then we have grid line 2, which is now in the middle, and grid line 3 on the right edge. And that's exactly what's happening here in the CSS. This property is saying, find the first grid line, so the left edge, then place a second grid line at 50% of the total width of the grid container, and place the last grid line after the remaining 50%. So as a result, we get 2 equal width columns within our grid. The default width of any row or column you create is auto, meaning as wide as the content wants within the available space of the grid. And you can use auto as a value if you want to over here, if you want a column or a row to expand and contract depending on the content that's within it. You can also declare column widths and row heights with any mix of measurement units you want. So you can mix pixel widths and ems and percentages and viewport widths and heights and everything else in the same declaration. So if I want to make a really weird grid, I can say 10 pixels and 4 ems and 20% and 50 VW. Save that. And here you can see we have a 10 pixel column, a 4M column, a 20% of the total width of the grid column, and then this one, which is 50% of the total width of the viewport. You'll also notice if I turn off this extend grid lines indefinitely, that the total width of my grid is now less than it was before because of how I declare this grid template columns property. But there's more. CSS Grid has 2 additional measurement units and tools you can use, the fraction unit and the min-max function. The fraction unit, marked up as FR, is pretty straightforward to use. In our example, instead of saying we want 50% of the space, we can just split the grid between 2 equal fractions, 1 FR, 1 FR. The FR unit takes the total available space and distributes it in fractions. So if I go over to my declaration here again and just say 1 FR, 1 FR, and save it, you'll see here again we have 2 equal width columns. If I then take up some space here by creating another column that's the width of 5 ems, for instance, you'll see that the remaining space is still split evenly between these 2 FR units. The FR unit allows us to work with fractions. So right now, if I have 1 FR, 1 FR, the 2 columns have equal widths. But if I set 1 FR and 2 FR, I'm in effect splitting it into 3 sections and then saying the first column has 1 fraction and the second column has 2 fractions. So here we end up with something that's more accurate than saying 33.3333333% and then doing that 3 times. The min-max function is slightly more advanced. It allows us to declare the minimum and maximum width of a column or row. This is especially useful in responsive web design because we can say things like, this column should never be narrower than 20 ems and never wider than 30 ems. This is similar to min width and max width, but within the context of columns and rows. And as you'll see later in the course, it allows us to create truly responsive layouts with CSS Grid. Finally, if you're creating a list of similar columns, there's a shorthand through the repeat notation. Let's say you want 4 columns of 1 FR. Well, instead of typing out 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, you can just say repeat 4, 1 FR. This repeats 1 FR 4 times. You can also do this with more advanced combinations. Say repeat 4, 1 FR 10 pixel gives you 8 columns alternating between 1 FR and 10 pixels in width. You can see what that looks like in the browser. Repeat 4, 1 FR, 10 pixels, save, and now we have a 1 FR column, then a 10 pixel column, then a 1 FR column, then a 10 pixel column, and so on, repeated 4 times. And of course, all this works exactly the same way for rows, giving you full control over every aspect of how your grid is laid out. One of the very first things you notice when you start working with CSS Grid layouts is that the grid items automatically place themselves on the grid. In the exercise files for this movie, I've created a new grid. So I'm just going to break this DevTools out here so you can see exactly what's happening. So in my new grid, I have 3 columns, one that's 2 FR, 2 that are 1 FR, you see here. And I also have 3 rows. The first row is set to auto height, meaning it'll be whatever height is necessary to display the content. The second row is set to 1FR, and the third row is set to 3FR, and is currently empty because these items are placing themselves automatically in the grid. This grid auto placement is a feature, not a bug. And it's tremendously useful when you start working with large groups of content and you just want them to auto-populate a defined grid, as you'll see later in the course. But if you're using CSS Grid to create custom layouts, it can often look really confusing, at least to begin with. So just keep this in mind as we move forward. Anytime you create a grid container and define cells within that container, the grid items will automatically populate the grid in the cells from the top left to the bottom right, unless you tell each grid item to do otherwise. That's what we'll do next. What makes CSS Grid such a powerful layout tool is it allows us to specify where on the grid any of the grid items should appear. In other words, once you use CSS Grid, you can put any item anywhere you want in the grid using only CSS, which is pretty magical. The most basic method for placing grid items on the grid is to declare the grid column and grid row values for each item. Grid column and grid row each take values corresponding with the lines on the grid. So if you want to place an item between column lines 2 and 4, you just declare grid column 2/4. And if you want to place an item between row lines 2 and 3, you just declare grid row 2/3. Using this technique, you can take each grid item in any layout and place it where it belongs in the grid. If we take the current example where we have the auto-placed contents, we can now move each of these items around to create the layout we want. So first, I want to move the masthead over to the right-hand side so it spans these 2 columns here. And I also want to move it 1 down so it goes from column line 2 to column line 4 and row line 2 to row line 3. To do that, I just create a rule for masthead, then say grid column 2/4. And grid row 2/3. Now the browser finds lines 2 and 4 and places the masthead between lines 2 and 4, and then finds lines 2 and 3 for the rows and places the item between those 2 lines. What you'll also notice is once we move one grid item out of the way, the other grid items will flow up to take up the new available space. So the page title now flows up to the first position and everything else flows in and fills up the grid for me. I can now grab another item and move it. Let's take the page title, and here I want the page title to span the full width at the top here. So from grid column line 1 to column line 4. Page title, grid column 1/4. And then I want it to span just one row. So I'll say grid row 1/2. Save, and page title now takes up the full width, and the other items flow into the available space. But because we've already declared the position of masthead stays in place. We can continue doing this with all our items. So if I want the main content to span the first column here, but all the way to the bottom, I'll say main content, grid column 1/2, grid row 2/4. And then the sidebar and footer take up the remaining available space. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice something weird happen here. You'll remember that this grid layout has one column that's 2FR wide and 2 columns that should be the same width, which is 1FR each. But this third column here is now much wider than the second one. This is an odd little quirk with CSS Grid that has to do with respecting the minimum width of the content. You see, in this footer box here, this section at the top takes up more space than 1FR in the current layout. As a result, the grid automatically expands this column to fit this minimal width content. This is something you have to keep in mind anytime you work with CSS Grid layouts, that if you introduce very long words or maybe images with specific widths or something like that, you may end up forcing the grid columns to be wider or taller than they originally were supposed to be. Now, there are ways around it. You can either break up the word, or you can take away overflow so that the part of the word gets cut off, or you can just simply place things differently. But the best solution is actually to create proper responsive grids, so this would never happen. So in our scenario, we would probably grab the footer and move it down below the content. But there's a bit of a problem here. If we go back into the developer tools and look at the grid, you'll see that here we have 3 rows, 1, 2, and 3. And currently the footer is sitting in the bottom row. So how can I move the footer down to a row that isn't there? Well, this is where we get into something called implicit lines. If we place an item in the grid outside of the existing rows or columns, the browser will generate new lines, either row lines or column lines for us to keep the grid structurally sound. And that means if we want to, we can just place things outside the grid and the browser will say, okay, you want a bigger grid? That's fine. I'll just add the additional lines necessary to make that work. So take a look at this. Footer content. We can define a new rule and then say grid column 1 to 4, so it spans the full width, and then grid row, and just declare the line number 4. So this is the last line right now. It's a little hard to see because we have that setting on, but if I turn here, extend grid lines indefinitely off, you'll see line 4 is the end line. And here I've said start at line 4, and then I'm not going to declare where it should end. I'll click save. And now a new line is created down here for line number 5, and the height of this new grid row is set to auto because we have not declared it ourselves. And we can take this one step further. In addition to declaring the line we want the item to start and stop at, we can also say how many columns or rows we want the specific items to span across using the span keyword. So for example, right now, the footer here is spanning across all 3 because I declared it to start at grid column line 1 and end at grid column line 4. Instead, I can go into grid column here and just say to span. Now the footer will start at line 1 because it just starts wherever it's currently placed. And then it spans across 2 columns because I said to span. If I want the footer to start at line 2, I simply go in here and say to/2 span. And now the footer starts at line 2 and spans across 2. And if I say 3 span instead, the same thing happens to columns as happened to rows previously. The browser says, oh, okay, you want an additional column that you didn't define? I can create that for you. And here we now have 4 columns instead of 3. But you notice, once you start using these implicit lines, the width or height will always be set to auto, and that means your grid will start looking really weird. Because of all this, my recommendation is to always place your items carefully within your predefined grid, unless you are creating some sort of consistent grid where you just want to auto-populate items. But don't get me wrong, implicit lines are tremendously useful in the right circumstances, and later on in the course, we'll use implicit lines to create some interesting layouts. However, implicit lines can also be a real problem if you don't keep track of your items and keep them within the carefully defined grid. But it's a solvable problem, and that's what we'll look at next. Using the gridline numbers to place items on the grid works fine, but it's a really abstract way of approaching layouts. If you think about it, when you look at this layout, you're not thinking line 1, line 2, line 3, and line 4. You're probably thinking something like, this is the main area, and then over here we have a sidebar area, and then there's a footer area on the bottom. And you want to use that kind of terminology when you create your CSS. Good news is you can, and there are 2 different approaches to this. And we'll cover those in this movie and the next one. The first approach is to name the lines, and there are several things you can do here. So let me explain how this works. You'll remember from when we declared the grid itself up here in the site rule that we said grid template columns and then defined the space between each of the lines. So if you imagine, you can see there's a line here in front of 2FR. Then there's a line after 2FR, there's a line after the 1FR, and then there's a line at the end here. The name of each line goes inside square brackets, and here you can give the lines any name you want as long as you use hyphens instead of spaces. So this first line here is the beginning edge. Then we have the halfway point. Then we have a quarter point, and then we have the end edge. Now that the lines have names, we can use these names instead of the numbers. So down here for masthead, I want the masthead to start at the halfway line and end at the end edge. So I'll say halfway, end edge. Save that. Go back in the browser and everything looks the same. Just to show you I'm not cheating, I can go in here and say quarter to end edge. Save that. And now you see the masthead is only over here in the full right-hand column. This can be useful, especially if you have sections of your grid and you often want to refer to certain lines in a certain way. However, it can also get really clunky if you have a lot of lines and you need to refer to both the beginning and end line all the time. So there's a built-in shorthand naming convention for named lines that you can use to simplify this drastically. To see how this works, we have to take another look at our layout. So in our layout, we have two main areas, right? There's this main area over here, which is the first column. And then you can see there's a sidebar area over here, which is these two columns. But you can imagine under certain circumstances, you may want to place stuff in just this far right-hand column. So let's call this main section here main, and this far right-hand column sidebar. Back in my code, I'll change the line names here. So I'll call the first line main start. And then the second line, which is the end of the start area, main end. Then I'll call this split line. So that is the line that goes down here in the middle of the sidebar for sidebar start. And the last line, sidebar end. Now that I've changed the names, I also need to change my declarations down here. So the masthead now goes from main end to sidebar end. The page title goes from main start to sidebar end. And the main content goes between main start and main end. Save that. Back in the browser, everything looks the same. That doesn't look like shorthand, though. This is equally clunky to what I did before. Well, let me show you the shorthand. Now that we're using these start and end suffixes on these lines, we can refer to just main or sidebar if we're talking about the span between these two lines. So for example, here at masthead, I say I want to start at main end, but then I want to span the entire sidebar. So I'll just say to sidebar. Save that, go back, looks the same. Then I can say page title, and here we go from main start to sidebar end. That means I can just say main and sidebar. Then we're just referring to the entire grid tracks. Again, looks the same in the browser. And finally, when we get to main content, which goes from main start to main end, we just simply say main. And again, looks exactly the same. To show you I'm not cheating, I'll then superimpose the sidebar on top of main. So I'll just say main here too. And now the sidebar stacks on top of the main content because I placed them both inside the same cells. What you've seen here is a really basic version of what you can do with named lines. And now that you know how it works, I encourage you to explore this further. Personally, I don't like using this approach because, among other things, you can't give one line two different names. So it becomes kind of tricky. You'll remember this area is called main and this area is called sidebar, but what is this thing in the middle here? For that reason, I like to use grid areas instead, which is what we'll cover in the next movie. However, there are times when named lines work better. So explore this, figure out exactly how it works, and look at how you can use both named lines and also these shorthands with the start and end suffixes. If you thought named lines were useful, you're going to love grid areas. If you ask me, grid areas may be the most important feature of the CSS grid specification. And once you see how it works, I think you'll agree. Here's the elevator pitch. Using the grid template area property on the grid container, grid areas allow us to define rectangular areas spanning one or more cells within a grid and give them names. Then we can use those names to place items within the grid using the grid area property on grid items. In other words, we turn the grid into a map and place items on that map, which opens the door to all sorts of cool stuff. Let me show you how this works. In the exercise files for this movie, I've taken out all the stuff that we added in the previous movies and just simplified down to the standard grid we had before and just these rules with nothing in them. As a result, our grid is back to the way it was before, where the items are auto-placed and everything looks really odd. Now we can add grid areas into our grid and then place items based on those grid areas. To do that, I go to my site rule and add a new property, grid template areas. And this property is unlike any other CSS property. Instead of adding in a setting or some sort of value, we're actually drawing out a map of our grid using text in place of individual cells. So to do this, I actually need to go back to my grid and look at it and figure out exactly what I want to do first. You'll remember in my layout, I want the title to go across all 3 columns at the top here. Then I want the main content to span 2 rows here on the leftmost column. I want the masthead to span the 2 right-hand columns on the 2nd row. And I want the sidebar to appear here in the middle column and the footer to appear over on the right in the right-hand column in the 3rd row. Knowing this, I can now literally draw out this grid using text. So I'll say the first cell in the top left-hand corner will be called title. And the second cell next to it will also be called title. And the 3rd one will be called title. And this is now the title grid area. So this is where, if we assign content, the content will appear. That was row 1. Then in row 2, we start out with main. Then we have masthead. And then we have masthead. And finally, on row 3, we start out with main again. So that means we have a grid area that's 2 rows high, but only 1 column wide. And then we have sidebar and footer. Now I can save my style sheet, go back in the browser, open my developer tools and go to Layout, select Body Site, and then click on this box, Display Grid Areas. And in return, the grid area titles are now displayed on top of the area. So here you see we have the title area across these 3 columns. Then we have the main area across this 1 column, but 2 rows. We have the masthead across 2 columns and 1 row. And finally, sidebar and footer. Now I can go into each of my elements and set the grid area property to assign the element to a specific area. So masthead, grid area, masthead. Page title, grid area, title. Main content, grid area, main. Sidebar, grid area, sidebar. And footer content, grid area, footer. Save that, jump back in the browser, and now you can see the page title is taking up the title grid area. Main content is taking up the main grid area. Masthead, the masthead grid area. Sidebar is in sidebar, and the footer content is in footer. At this point, you probably see why I think this is so powerful. Right now, this layout is entirely defined inside this site rule using this grid template areas property. And that means all I need to do is change the property here and I can move content around in my layout. So let's say I want masthead and sidebar to swap places. Well, all I have to do is go in here and see where sidebar is being referenced. So it's here. So I say masthead here. And then where there's masthead, masthead, I'll just say sidebar, sidebar. And now the masthead is down here and the sidebar is up here. I didn't do anything to the sidebar or the masthead elements. I just messed around with grid template areas. And this becomes tremendously useful when you work with responsive websites. So you know how when you create a responsive layout, you have to think about where every single element is, and then you may need to move things around, and that requires rewriting all your CSS or doing anything. You don't have to do any of that stuff anymore because of grid template areas. All you have to do is define the grid, then set up your grid template areas, and then create a new media query and change the grid template areas, and then things will just jump around to where you need them to be. Let me show you exactly how that could work. So I'm going to copy out this site rule and then paste it in below and wrap it inside a media query. So I'll say @media screen and min width 600 pixels. And then we get this new site rule. Close my media query. And inside this rule, I'm going to take out display grid and take out grid template rows because I don't need them, but I'll leave grid template columns and the grid template areas in place. Then I'll go up to the first rule. So this is the one that will apply to all browsers below 600 pixels wide. And then I'll simplify the grid template columns to just 2 1FRs and simplify the grid template areas to title, main masthead, main sidebar, and footer. Save this, go back in the browser, and now you'll see the power of grid template areas. Right now, the browser is like 700 and something pixels wide. When I reduce the width here down to 600 pixels, the layout changes. So here you see the footer drop down to the bottom. I can do it again. If you've played around with responsive web design before, you'll know this opens the door to layouts and designs that you've always wanted to do, but you've never been able to. And there is one more level to this, which is truly unique to CSS Grid. Using this exact approach, you can create empty white space within your layout without that causing any problems. So let's say, for example, I want to open up this space here, this one cell, to nothing so that we have a blank cell in the middle. Well, if I go into my layout, this is the 3-column layout, and replace masthead with just a dot, save it, go back, we now have actual white space in the layout. This is an empty cell with no content in it, and everything else just flows around it. And when I reduce the width of the screen, everything realigns. In the opening to this movie, I said, if you ask me, grid areas may be the most important feature of the CSS Grid specification. And now that you've seen how it works, I'm pretty sure you agree. There is one more feature in CSS Grid I want to show you before we jump into advanced layouts, and that is the grid gap. If I turn off this overlay grid for a second, you'll see that right now, each of our grid rows and grid columns are jamming up against the next one. And that's great for a lot of designs, but sometimes you have layouts and designs where you require some space in between each of these items. Now, of course, you could solve this by going into an individual element and then adding some margin around it by going like margin 1em or something like that. But all you're doing then is creating space around the individual cell. You're not dealing with how the grid is laid out. A much cleaner way would be to create actual space between each of these grid lines, or what we call gutters, inside the grid. And using the CSS Grid specification, we can do just that. In CSS Grid terminology, the space between each column or each row is called a grid gap. And you set it up by simply declaring grid gap and then set the width of the gap. So let's just try to set it at something like 1em and see what happens. Save that, go back in the browser, and here you see we now have a gap both horizontally and vertically between each of the cells. And you'll also see that in the case where one item is spanning across multiple different cells, we don't see that gap. So it only applies to the actual space between cells, not areas, or not anything else. Going back to the layout panel and clicking on the overlay for grid, you can also see that the overlay is showing you these grid gaps between each item. So now that you know what they are, we can start doing interesting things with them. Because you don't have to declare just a grid gap for both columns and rows. You can individually declare for either columns or rows. So you can say grid column gap 1em, and you just get the column gap. Or you can say grid row gap, and you just get the row. Or you can use a shorthand and say grid gap 1em, 2em. And now the row gap is 1em and the column gap is 2em. So this gives you detailed control over exactly how much space is between each of the grid rows or the grid columns. And later in the course, you'll see me use this for some different effects. There's one important thing to note here, though. The grid gap, as you can see, only applies inside the grid. It does not wrap around the edges of the grid. So if you want to have a grid gap and then have the appearance of the grid gap spanning outside of the grid, you need to apply some sort of margin or padding around the grid container as well. So here you can see the body element with the class site has margin 1em set to it, and that's why you have this white space around it. If I took that margin away, you'll see that we don't have that space around it. So in short, grid gap creates space between each column or row inside your layout, while at the same time respecting any item that spans across multiple rows, multiple columns, or is displayed inside a grid area. CSS Grid is a foundational change where web layouts are concerned. This is the first true two-dimensional layout tool that allows us to approach what is displayed in the browser viewport as a whole rather than a random assortment of loosely related parts. Using CSS Grid introduces a whole new approach to web layouts and web design. We are now working from the outside in. Start with a grid, then place our content on that grid. This in turn requires us to think carefully about the relationships between different items of content, both from an HTML semantics perspective, from a communication perspective, and from a layout and design perspective. This is what we'll be looking at in this chapter. To start off, let's address some not so obvious features in CSS Grid because they'll help inform our work later. The first one is one of CSS Grid's key features. Only direct first-level descendants of a grid container are grid items. That means if you have descendants of descendants you want to place on the grid, you have to first create a new nested grid. In the original grid specification, there was something called subgrids that allowed an element to inherit the grid layout from its parents, but that has not been implemented in any browsers. As a result, you may feel compelled to flatten your HTML to make every item a direct descendant of the grid container. This is not a good idea. The whole point of CSS Grid is to be able to work with semantic and properly nested HTML markup. Instead, embrace the idea of grid nesting. Create multiple grids within a single view to address different concerns. You can have one grid for overall layout, another for the main content, and more specific ones for individual content blocks. You'll see all of this when we move on in this course. The second feature is that CSS Grid creates a true grid. By that, I mean you're now working with strict rows and columns. One of the very first things people tried to do once CSS Grid came to browsers was to create Masonry-style layouts where the height of each item is defined by its content, and you get this organic, semi-random structure. This is not a grid. In fact, it's the antithesis of a grid. The purpose of a grid is to establish clearly defined grid tracks in the form of columns and rows and place contents within these tracks. This means you have to think carefully about how the length of the contents of one cell affects the height of the whole row. This takes some practice, and you'll find that in many cases, the absoluteness of the grid tracks may seem to get in the way of what you're trying to do. In my experience, this is because you're trying to use one grid where multiple nested grids are required. We'll cover some concrete examples of this later in the course. The third feature is content stacking. Any grid item can be placed in any grid cell or group of cells on the grid, and when you manually place items in a cell, the browser will allow you to place multiple items on top of one another in that same cell. The items are displayed in their HTML source order, meaning the further down in the HTML document an item is, the higher up in the stack it appears. You can then manipulate the Z-index position of individual items to bring them to the surface or hide them under other items. As you'll see later on, this makes things like positioning text on top of images absurdly easy and does away with the complex absolute positioning and other hacky solutions we've been using so far. On the downside, if you don't pay close attention to where you place your items, you can easily cover something important, so pay attention and check everything you do in the browser, especially when you're doing manual positioning. The fourth feature is content ordering. Thanks to the ability to place any grid item anywhere within the grid, you can visually change the order of your content without changing the HTML markup structure. This can be a huge benefit, but it also invites some risky behavior and can cause serious accessibility issues. I'll talk more about this later on, but the rule of thumb here is to make sure you don't change the meaning of your content by changing its display order. A visitor should get the same content in the same structured order, whether they look at the CSS grid layout or just read the HTML from top to bottom. The fifth and final feature is simply that CSS Grid is pure CSS. Once you've properly marked up your HTML, you can do pretty much whatever you want with your layouts because the grid is purely visual. You can toggle grids on and off or change their columns, rows, grid areas, or anything else at any time using media queries or JavaScript or whatever you like. CSS Grid gives you a truly dynamic design interface where you can serve up any grid at any time and place any item anywhere you like within that grid. You're never confined to a grid, and there is no reason you need to use the same grid to do different things. So, make grids that work, and if they don't do what you want, just change them until you get where you want to go. When I started working with CSS Grid, I quickly realized my previous experience working with web layouts was blocking my ability to make full use of this new layout module. To get around this problem, I went back to basics and started working with grid layouts on paper, and it turned out this is a great way to formalize your thinking around what grids are needed and how they are formed. Because CSS Grid works from the outside in, you have to define your grids before you place items in them. That means you have to have at least a rough idea of what the grid should look like before you start writing your CSS. So here's what I do. First, I make some general drafts about how I want my layouts to appear across different screen widths, starting with the smallest screen and moving up. I'm not targeting specific screen widths at this point, just figuring out how the layout changes as more space is made available. Next, I draw grid lines over my layout to see how my contents are grouped. This also tells me if the grid needs to change as the width of the viewport increases. Finally, I break the grid apart into multiple grids if necessary. This usually results in one overall layout grid handling headers and sidebars and footers and such, and at least one content grid focusing specifically on just the main content area. Splitting my grids apart like this opens the door to creating different content grids for different types of content, which makes the layout more modular and easier to work with. For complex sites, I might repeat this process several times for different content models and sections, and in many cases I end up with 5 or 6 or even 10 different grids for different views, which is the beauty of all of this. CSS Grid gives us total layout control without requiring a lot of extra HTML markup to work, and we can create as many grids as we like. One last note here. It may be tempting to use CSS Grid to create a classic X-column grid system where you separate the layout into, say, 16 columns and then place your content within these columns. I want to urge you to walk away from this type of thinking. CSS Grid gives you all the tools you need to create custom grids for your content, and there is no reason for drawing out a complex 16-column grid if all you need is 3 columns. Between regular units, FR, min-max, span, and all the other features that come with CSS Grid, you can create grid lines and place grid items to correspond with any grid you like, and you're not confined to any grid system. So, let your content be free and design grids that work for your content rather than the other way around. CSS Grid is cutting-edge technology, and though browser support is there for modern browsers, it is non-existent for older browsers. This is a classic blocker for any new web technology. If it doesn't work everywhere, designers and developers are reluctant to use it anywhere. I want to change that. Here's the thing. This notion that a website must look the same across all browsers is a falsehood. We've been deliberately making websites that don't look the same across all browsers since 2010. In fact, we pride ourselves on doing this. It's called responsive web design. We build websites that show the content in the best possible way based on the available viewport area. This should also apply to new technologies. I know what I'm about to say may sound a bit extreme, but bear with me. CSS Grid is going to be the standard layout module for the web, so you might as well start using it today. And while you can take the time to build fallbacks for older browsers to create similar experiences, I don't think you should. Instead, create a baseline experience for all browsers based on the mobile small screen layout, and then progressively enhance the experience for modern browsers using CSS Grid. Yes, this means users of older browsers will get the simpler mobile layout. But here's the thing. If it works on mobile, it also works on wider desktop screens. Look no further than Wikipedia, and you'll see the mobile experience here is often better than the desktop experience. The only relevant difference between a small screen and a big screen is the available space. Mobile-first design forces us to prioritize and structure our content so it's easily digestible. Design for wider screens is just a continuation of this that takes advantage of the wider space. So scaling up your mobile design should be no problem for older browsers. To sum up, you have options here. If you want to or need to, create fallbacks for older browsers by creating CSS for every browser and serving up your CSS Grid code inside feature queries that test for CSS Grid support. Or do what I do, create a mobile-first layout that works in all browsers, and then progressively enhance the layout with CSS Grid for modern browsers. The latter option requires less work and is, in my opinion, better modern web design, so that's what we'll be doing moving forward. Just remember, there are no right or wrong answers here, and every project is unique, so find the best solution that works for your project. Just make sure you're making a decision based on user outcomes, not some stale idea about how everything should always look the same everywhere, because that's not how any of this works. As with any other web technology, our primary concern when using CSS Grid is accessibility. And the great news is CSS Grid makes building accessible websites easier. Because CSS Grid separates the visual presentation of content from their HTML markup order, we no longer have to make compromises about our HTML structure to create compelling layouts and designs. And because CSS Grid gives us a proper two-dimensional grid to work with, we no longer have to create complex container nesting setups just to get one item to appear next to another item, which makes our markup cleaner, simpler, and more accessible. Working with CSS Grid, I have a simple mantra, and I think it's so important that I've created a printout in the exercise files you should actually print out and stick on your wall right behind your monitor. It goes like this. Number 1, make it accessible. Number 2, make it fancy. And number 3, make sure the fancy doesn't break accessibility. This goes for all web design, but especially for CSS Grid. Like I explained before, because you can place grid items anywhere within the grid, you'll feel compelled to start shuffling content around and changing content order. Anytime you do this, make sure you don't break the natural semantic order of your content in the process. Use a screen reader to read out your content as you look at the screen to make sure the experience is the same whether you read the content or have it read back to you. Use the tab key on your keyboard to make sure the tab order of your content is logical and that the focused items are clearly visible. And, when in doubt, have an accessibility expert do a site audit to ensure you meet the WCAG accessibility guidelines. The only reason for publishing content on the web is for people to be able to access that content, and that's only possible if your content is accessible. It's really that simple. The most obvious use case for CSS Grid is in creating multi-column layouts. In this chapter, I'll show you how to make a conventional 3-column layout, how to make an unconventional version of that layout, how to center these layouts on the center of the screen, and also how to do some magic with CSS Grid, breaking content out of a sub-element to display on the grid itself. And we'll make all of these layouts using the exact same HTML document. We'll start with the conventional 3-column layout. Here, all we have to do is create a grid with 3 columns. Then we place the grid items on the grid, either automatically or using Gridline references. Got it? Okay, let's get this working in real life. In the exercise files for this movie, you'll find the baseline HTML document and styles for our 3-column layout. If you open this in the browser, you'll see that right now we are looking at the fallback layout for the site. So this is the mobile layout just scaled up to fit a wider screen. I've done that by restricting the max width of all the content. And when you scroll down, you just see all the content is stacked one piece after the other in a vertical stack. All this content is fully accessible, easy to read, and easy to maintain, but it is not being displayed in a 3-column layout. That's what we want to do here. To start off, let's take a quick look at the HTML document so you understand the structure. We start out with this body that has the class site, and currently this is what is being used in the style sheet to restrict the width and also center align all the content. It's done right here in the style sheet. Next, we have a skip to content link. This link is absolutely positioned off screen and only appears if you use the tab key to tab through things in the page. This is for accessibility, and it's a requirement for this page to pass accessibility tests. It is also irrelevant to our conversation because once you position an element either absolutely or fix it, it's taken out of the context of the grid, so it will not be placed on the grid. Next, we have a series of first-level children of the body element. First one is header, that displays a logo and a site title. Then we have a figure with a class feature that displays an image. There's a main with a series of sections inside it, including splash, buckets, and more. Then we have an aside with a class sidebar that has two elements inside, both with the classes twin. And finally, we have the footer. In my layout, what I want to do is move the header over to the left-hand side in the first column, then display all the main content here in the second center column, and display this sidebar content here over in the third column, and then have the footer span the full width of the screen. We can do all this by defining a grid on the main container, and in this case, that would be the body element with a class site. The very first thing we need to do is make sure the browser actually supports CSS Grid before we ask it to use CSS Grid for our layouts. We'll do that all the way at the bottom of style main.css. You'll find here there's already a comment that sets up CSS Grid layout for modern browsers. And inside this section, I want to use a feature query to ask the browser, hey, do you support CSS Grid? If so, run this code. Otherwise, just ignore everything. It looks like this, @supports. And then we specify what we are looking for. And in this case, I want to test for grid area auto. Now, if you look on the internet, you'll find a lot of people recommend testing for display::grid. The problem with that is some older browsers actually have legacy support for the old version of CSS Grid, so they'll answer true to that question, even though they don't support the current modern spec. As a result, things that you add in that you think should work might not work in these older browsers. However, if you test for grid area auto, you're testing for something that's only in the new spec for grid, and that means if the browser says yes to this question, you have full grid support and you can set up your own grid. Now we're ready to set up the grid. Just like in any other web design, we're going to start mobile first and scale the viewport up and then find out where the natural breakpoints are for our grid. To do that, I'll go into the developer tools and preview my site using the responsive design mode. And here you can see on small screens, everything looks fine. It's a nice single column layout. And as I start widening the viewport, we get to a natural point where the content starts looking weird if it continues to widen. So it's restricted. And that point is around 900 pixels or 50 ems. This is also the natural breakpoints for when we want to introduce columns. However, this is an intermediate breakpoint. So for a screen that's about this width, so 50 ems or thereabouts, I don't want to have a 3-column layout. I want to have a 2-column layout. So I'll put a column here on the left-hand side and then put all the main content on the right-hand side. And then as we keep scaling up the width of the viewport to about maybe 60 or 65 ems, then I want to introduce the 3rd column on the right-hand side here. So what goes in the columns? Well, in the left-hand column, I want to place the header. So the header, this G and is for grid, will go into the left-hand column, and then it'll take up the entire column. Then the center column will hold all the main content, so this big featured image and all the text and everything. And the eventual right-hand column will hold the sidebar content. So that's these 2 boxes here, the blue one and the peachy pink-red thing down here. Finally, on the very bottom, I have the footer, and I want the footer to span the full width of the available space. To start the process, I'll set up a media query that targets that first circumstance where I want 2 columns, and I'll make that breakpoint at 50 ems. So at media, screen, and min width 50 em. The grid container in this case will be the body element with the class site, because all the elements we want to position within the grid are direct descendants of this body element. So the header, the figure, the content, and so on. Site already has a rule up here that sets the max width to 50 ems, so I need to disable that when we're using grid. So I'll start by doing that. Site, max width, none. And then I'll set up my grid, display, grid. And I need to introduce some columns. And here, we're still working in that intermediary space where we just have 2 columns. So I'll say grid, template, columns. And I'll set the first column to 15 ems and the second column to auto. This allows the first column to have a fixed width, whereas the remaining space will be filled out by the second column. Now I'll save this, go back in the browser, and you can see the grid has been created, but content is kind of haphazardly placed within it, which is exactly what we expect. So the header is positioned where it's supposed to be on the left-hand side. The featured image is where it's supposed to be, right here on the right-hand side. But as we scroll down, you'll see the main content is sitting in the first column, and the sidebar content is sitting in the second column. This needs to be fixed before we can move on. With the grid in place, we can start placing the grid items where we want them to appear. Just to remind you, I want the header to appear here where it is right now on the left-hand side, then the featured image and the main content, which is currently in the first column, in the second column. Because we're currently looking at the 2-column layout, I also want the sidebar content here to appear in this second column. And at the very bottom, I want the footer to appear across both columns. To do this, I first need to visualize my grid. So I'll open my developer tools, go to the layout panel, check the body site grid so I can see the overlay, and make sure display line numbers is checked as well so I can see the line numbers. Now I can position all my contents based on these line numbers, which is 1, 2, and 3, because we're working with a 2-column grid. The items I want to place are the direct descendants of the body with a class site. So these would be the header, class masthead, the figure, class feature, the main, class main area, and the aside class sidebar. All of this is done inside the media query we already established. So I'll start at the top, masthead. That's the header. And I want that one to appear grid column 1/2. Then feature. That's the featured image. Grid column 2/3. Then the main area. Grid column 2/3 as well. The sidebar, grid column 2/3. And finally, colophon, which is the footer, grid column 1/3. Save this, go back in the browser, and now, if I break this out, you'll see here we have the header in the top left-hand column. Then we have the featured image, the full content, the sidebar content, and then the footer spans across both columns, which is exactly what we want. So far, so good. This 2-column layout works fine for medium width viewports, but I promised you a 3-column layout where the sidebar content moves up to the right-hand column. So let's set that up. Actually, adding the columns is easy enough. All we have to do is create a new media query for a wider viewport and then change the site rule to have grid template columns set to 3 instead of 2 columns. So at the bottom here, I'll create a new media query. And I'll just set it to 65 ems because I'm working on a really small screen here. Then I'll create a new rule for sites. And inside that rule, we'll call for grid template columns 15em, auto, and 15em. So this will give us 2 fixed width columns, one on the left and one on the right, and then an auto-sized content area in the middle. Save this, go back in the browser, and here we have the new column on the right-hand side. But right now, there's no content in it, not at the top, not at the bottom. To fix that, we need to grab the 2 items we want to reposition. That would be the sidebar and the colophon, and create new rules for them. So I'll copy out the current rules and paste them in under our new media query. For the sidebar, I now want it to appear between grid lines 3 and grid lines 4. So that's the 3rd column on the right-hand side. And the colophon should span the full width from 1 all the way to 4. Save that, go back in the browser, and now the sidebar is appearing in the right column, but it's leaving this huge empty space at the top. So what's happening here? Well, this has to do with how the browser auto-positions content on a grid. Let me show you what I mean. If we go back to index.html, you'll remember we set up the grid on the body element with the class site. Then inside the body element, we have a series of elements. We have the header, the figure, so this is the image. Then we have the main, and all the way down here at the bottom, we have the sidebar. So what happens is when the browser lays out this grid, it says, okay, here's the header, where do you want it? And we say we want it in the first column. Okay, I'll put it in the first column. Here I have the featured image. Where do you want it? We want it in the second column. So I'll put that in the second column. Okay, here I have the main content. Where do you want it? We'll put that in the second column too. And then the browser asks, where do you want the sidebar? And we say, put it in the right-hand column. And the browser says, sure, I'll do that. But you didn't specify which row I want to put it in. And since it comes after the main content, I'll just put it next to the main content. So that's why it's appearing here on the right-hand side underneath the featured image. To move it up, we therefore have to specify which row we want the sidebar content to appear in. Back in sitemain.css, I'll find the sidebar rule, say grid row, and then I'll try to just say grid row 1 because I want it to appear just in grid row 1 from the top. Save that. Go back. Now the sidebar appears from the top down. However, the height of the sidebar content is now pushing the grid line for the first row down, and we get this huge empty space underneath the featured image. So how do we fix that? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, actually. We just make sure that the sidebar spans more than one grid row. So if I go in here, I'll say 1, 2, 3, so that it spans 2 grid rows. Save that. Now the sidebar spans down next to the main content. The featured image appears at the top here. And we have this weird little white space at the bottom. And to be honest, that white space has actually been there the whole time. If I reduce the screen width here with a responsive view, you'll see here, when the first media query kicks in, we have a huge white space at the bottom below the image. And it only goes away when we span up the width of the viewport. And then it reappears here when we introduce the third column. What's happening here is exactly the same thing that was happening with the sidebar. Only this time, the culprit is the header. The header has a minimum height, which is the content in it. And therefore, the grid line for the first row is down here. And the featured image doesn't have the height to fill in that space. How do we solve this? Same way we solved it with the sidebar. Only this time, I'll do it up here in the first media query. Masthead, that's the header. Grid row 1/3. Save, go back in the browser. No more white space at the bottom here. And no matter what width I have, everything is looking as it should. So why am I showing you this? Well, it has a simple answer. When you work with CSS Grid, a lot of weird things like this will happen along the way, and you need to figure out exactly how many rows or columns each of your items need to occupy for everything to work. As you're doing that, you also have to consider what happens in odd circumstances. For example, right now I'm saying that the sidebar content here is spanning 2 full row heights. So what happens if the content in the center here is much shorter? Well, in my example, it's not a problem because the row line for the second row will be down here underneath the sidebar. And the next item below is the footer, which should be terminated at the top here under the sidebar, not where the main content appears. However, there are other circumstances where you might have to span the sidebar content across 3 or 4 or 5 rows to ensure that everything is working properly. And you really have to test this with real content in the browser to see exactly how everything is working. If you run into major issues with this, the best solution is to abandon using grid lines as your layout and instead use grid template areas, because then you can define exactly which areas a specific piece of content should go in. And you can just say that the entire column on the left-hand side is going to be the sidebar, or the entire column on the right-hand side is going to be the header, or something like that. But in our example, as you can see, once we figure out what's going on, we can use grid line numbers and everything works fine. One of the things I really love about working with CSS Grid is it opens up opportunities to do things that we haven't really been able to do before, or things that used to be really difficult to do when it comes to layouts. So let me give you one example of that. Let's say in this 3-column layout, I want my featured image to span the 2 last columns. So the featured image spans all the way across to the edge of the screen, and the sidebar falls down below it. Doing this without CSS Grid would require doing some weird stuff with floating this main content next to the sidebar content and wrapping a container around it. But because we're working with CSS Grid, we can just reposition content or make it span bigger areas without really doing much at all. Let me show you how to approach this. So first I'll go into Inspect Element. And this time I'm not going to go to the layout. Instead, I'll go to the rules. So let's see. I'll pull this over here so you can actually see what's going on. Then I need to find my feature. This is the featured image. And currently it says grid column 2 to 3. So if I want the featured image to span these 2 columns, I need to change that to grid column 2 to 4. What happens now is because we already have some content inside this 4th grid column, the featured image drops down below that content. That looks pretty weird. So we need to fix that. And the way we fix that is by also grabbing the sidebar element. So that's down here. This is currently set to grid row 1 and 3. So I'll change that to just grid row 2. It now falls down below the featured image. And here we have this new and very different layout that is quite unusual, especially for this type of 3-column layout, where the header takes up the full left-hand side, the featured image takes up the 2 right-hand columns, the main content is here in the center, and the sidebar is on the right. But you noticed all of this happened purely in CSS. I didn't do anything to the HTML, and there is no wrapper wrapping these 2 elements to help them float next to one another. This is purely CSS Grid positioning. Now that I've done it in the browser and I know it works, I should really do it in my code as well. So here, I'll grab feature and set grid column to 2/4. And then I'll change sidebar here to be in grid row 2. Or actually, I can just take grid row out altogether and just save it. Go back. Layout looks the way it's supposed to. I can now inspect the element and turn on my responsive view to just check that everything works. Here we have the 2-column view. And now when I scale up to a full width, the sidebar just pops in on the right-hand side here next to the main content, and this featured image appears at the very top. I like to call this breaking the grid because someone who visits this will feel like this is a weird grid where we have a column here, and then there's a huge cell at the top here, and then we have 2 grid cells on the left and right-hand side. But as you saw, the only thing I did was make one of these elements that traditionally would have been centered span across 2 columns instead of 1. And this opens a lot of opportunities for doing interesting new things with layouts. You could do the same with a header and have it span just the 2 first columns, or have this featured image span the 2 first columns and leave the 3rd one empty. Or you could have content down here in the main content span the 2 first or the 2 last columns and so on. The opportunities are pretty much endless here, and you just have to experiment in the browser and see what happens when you place things in less obvious locations, and then experiment and find out the layouts that you want that break the grid in new and exciting ways. This 3-column layout we've created right now is full width and will continue to be full width regardless of how wide the viewport is. In some cases, that is what you want. In other cases, it's not. So what do you do if you want to restrict the max width of this grid layout without using traditional methods? This is where things get really interesting. The grid layout module spec inherits a bunch of functionality from the Flex Layout module, or Flexbox. And one of those functionalities is the ability to justify the content left or right or center. So check this out. If I want to restrict the total width of my grid, all I need to do is go into my media query here at 65, and instead of having the middle column set to auto, I'll set it to 30 ems. Or even better, I'll set it to min, max, auto, 30 ems. So that way, at the most, the middle column will be 30 ems wide. In my browser, you can now see the content is being restricted to that width. And right now, because I haven't set anything, it's being aligned to the left-hand side. Now I can use the developer tools, target the body with the class site and find the rule for that. And then I'll add in justify content. Now, justify content is something you're used to using with Flexbox, but you can also use it to position a grid inside its container. So we're talking here about the container that holds the grid, how the grid is positioned inside that container. So by default right now, because the text direction is left to right, it's positioned to the left. I can change that to center, and the grid shifts off to the center. So you can see some space was added here on the left-hand side to align the content to the center. And that space matches the space on the right-hand side exactly. I can also set it to right. Now the grid shifts off all the way to the right. And I can even use Flex N to do the same thing. So here you can see the layout behaves just like a regular Flexbox would if we used justify content, except this is a grid. So if we want to position this grid in the center without using the traditional methods of setting a max width and then having margin left and right position it, we can simply say justify content, center, save it, go back in the browser and close the developer tools. And here the content is centered across all screen widths. In the exercise files for this movie, you'll find a slightly modified version of the project we've been working with throughout this chapter. The only current difference is I've moved the header back on top and it's spanning all 3 columns. And when we reduce the width of the screen, it spans 2 columns, and this left-hand column here is left. What I want to show you now goes outside of what we commonly use CSS Grid for and shows you how you can use CSS Grid in really unusual ways to do surprising things that are very outside of what you think is possible. So I'm going to show you 2 things. The first one is blatantly obvious. The second one is absolutely not obvious at all, and I need to show it to you so you know that this is actually possible. So the first thing I want to do is simply move the sidebar content here up into the sidebar on the left-hand side. And I want to do that for slightly narrower screens. So I'll go in here and open the responsive view and then find the narrow screen where there's space for the sidebar here on the left-hand side. Now, this is straightforward, right? We already know how to do this. You simply toggle on the grid and find the grid lines. So that's 1 and 2. And then we just make sure that we place the sidebar between the column lines 1 and 2 and the row lines 2 and 4. So if I go into my style sheet here, I can find sidebar. Right now it's at the grid column 2 and 3, so I'll change that to 1 and 2, and then set grid row to 2 and 4. Save that. The sidebar now floats up from the bottom, up next to the main content, and it's displaying on the left-hand side instead of the right-hand side. So this changes the overall structure of the displayed content because now it looks like the sidebar content here is higher up in the hierarchy. But in this particular circumstance, it's okay. You can imagine this could be something like an ad or something like a form that people need to fill in or whatever. There are reasons why you may want to place content here. And as long as you make sure your accessibility structure is intact, this is okay. Now, what I want to do next is the crazy part. Right now, the sidebar is displaying both the blue box and the red box, and that's because they both belong to the same grid item. What I want to do on wider screens is move the red box over to the right-hand side here. But how do I do that when the red box is part of this grid item? The answer is you make another grid inside this item, and then you place one item on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side. The complicated part is if you do that, you just leave a lot of empty space at the top. But there's a way of getting around all this. So let me show you how this is done. The first thing we'll do is make sure the item here, the grid item, inherits the same exact grid as what we're working with so far. So in my style sheet, I'll go down to the media query for min width 65ems. And I'll create a new rule here for sidebar. And then I'll say display, inherit. That inherits display grid from the parent item. And then I'll say grid template columns inherit. And that inherits grid template column from the parent item, which is up here. So now inside the sidebar element, we have the same exact grid set up. The next thing is to make sure the sidebar spans the full width of the original grid. So down here, I'll say grid column 1 to 4. And at this point, I can save it, go back to my browser and take a look. So what's happening now is the sidebar item, the grid item, is displaying here at the top directly under the header because that's where we positioned it between row lines 2 and 4. And the two first items inside are taking up two first columns, which is column 1 and column 2. The next thing I need to do is move this second item over to the third column. It's a little bit tricky because if we go look at the markup and scroll down, you'll see inside the aside with the class sidebar, both of these items have the class twin. So I'll use a pseudo class for this. Twin, last of type. So that gives me just the second one. And then I'll say grid column 3 to 4. Now we're operating inside the grid, inside the sidebar. Save that, go back, and now that item is appearing here on the right-hand side. Then we have to solve the seemingly impossible problem of this extra space between them. Because since we're now operating with a new grid up here, we can't simply float this content up, and we can't position it inside this grid, so we have to do something else. And this is where the absolutely crazy thing comes in. What we can do now is exploit how the browser behaves to make these grid items appear on the left and right-hand side and still have this content come up to display in the middle. The way we do that is by setting the height of this new grid inside the grid item to be 0 pixels tall. And then we just rely on the browser to display the content anyway because we haven't set the overflow to hidden. Let me show you how this works. The first thing I want to do, just for clarity, is to make sure that this item only spans one row instead of two. So I'll go back into sidebar and say grid row 2 to 3. That just makes sure it's one row here. Then I'll take the sidebar and set height to 0. That reduces the height of the container to 0, but because overflow allows us to overflow content outside of any bounding box in CSS, the content still appears. It's just outside of the defined box. So as a result, we get the layout we want, even though we're technically not positioning these items on the main grid, we're positioning them on a subgrid. This is something totally new, and you cannot do it with any other CSS tool. There are some downsides to this. If there's content that appears below these two boxes, it might be covered or end up covering these two boxes because technically the browser does not understand the height of them. But if you're placing them in empty columns like I have now, this works fine, even though it shouldn't. So now, instead of having a single grid across the entire site, I have two grids stacked on top of one another, and I'm taking advantage of the overflow capability in CSS to allow content to overflow and create what seems like an advanced grid while still retaining the original structure in my HTML. This is pure CSS Grid magic. CSS Grid provides a clean solution to the ever-popular full-bleed single-column layout, but the solution is not immediately obvious for reasons that will become clear right now. The full-bleed single-column layout features sections and images that span the full width of the viewport, thereof full bleed, and the contents within each section are center-aligned with a max width. Doing this without CSS Grid requires a lot of extra container nesting and can be quite messy on the HTML side. With CSS Grid, the HTML is nice and clean, but we have to think a bit outside the box to get the layout to work. Here's the challenge. Technically, what we're looking for in this layout is a 4-column grid where full bleed content takes up all 4 columns and the centered content takes up the 2 middle columns. The problem is we can't use a single global grid to do this because the grid items would be the individual sections and we would have no way of aligning the contents within those sections to the grid. So what do we do? The solution is to apply the same grid to each section, effectively making a list of matching grids. That way, we can align the contents within each section to the grid, since they are grid items, while at the same time controlling the overall layout because all the grids are controlled using the same CSS rule. Got it? All right, let's get this working in real life. In the exercise files for this movie, you'll find the baseline HTML document and styles for our full bleed single column layout. Looking at index.html, you'll see this is a very standard HTML document. We start out with a body with a class site. Then we have a skip to content link, which is required for accessibility. Then there's a header with a class masthead that displays some text and a large image. Then we have a main with a class main area, and this is where all the main content sits. And inside the main, we have a series of sections. First one with a class splash that displays the splash content, which has some text. Then we have a section with a class buckets. In here, we have an unordered list that displays 3 list items. Each list item has an image, an age 3 title, and a paragraph. We have a section with a class more that also displays some text content. And then finally, inside the main, we have a section with the class twins that has 2 divs, each with a class twin that displays some text. Outside the main, at the very bottom, we have a footer with a class colophon that contains 2 asides, each with some text and a link. Right now, all of this is styled with a basic mobile-first layout that restricts the total content width and central lines everything on wider screens. So this will be our fallback for the design as we move forward. If you open this in the browser, you'll see on the mobile screen, this looks nice and tidy. We have all the content stacked from top to bottom and everything is easy to read. Widening the viewport, you'll also see at a certain point, the total width of the content is restricted, and we get this nice, easy to read flow of content. This is what I was talking about when I said everything should always fall back to a mobile-first layout. Well, this works fine in all browsers and is easy to understand. The only thing we're missing at this point is the full bleed component. Scrolling down towards the middle, you will notice there are 3 boxes here. And these boxes are using Flex or Flexbox to display one next to the other, so we get equal height columns. I'm using Flex here because this is a one-dimensional layout. We're only laying out content in one direction, not 2 directions. So there's no point using Grid to do something Flex can do just fine. Scrolling towards the bottom, you'll find these 2 boxes. There's a blue box and a peachy box. The idea is these boxes should each take up half of the available viewport space and display one next to the other. I'm not doing that now because that would require floating and clearing, and I don't want to do that because that would then require extra containers and everything. So right now, for the fallback, they're displaying one underneath the other. The point of showing you this is there's nothing wrong with this layout. It's not perfect, but everything is where it's supposed to be. It's easy to read, it's easy to handle. This works just fine. So where do we want to go? Well, I want this featured image up here to span the full width of the available space inside the viewport, so be full bleed. Then I want the background for this section here, this tan yellowish background, to span the full width. I want the gray background here for the 3 buckets to span the full width. And for both of these sections, I still want to restrict the total width of the content to what you see here. This content here has no background, so it should just be constrained to the current width it has. And then finally, these 2 sections here should split the total viewport width evenly between them. So we get the blue box on the left-hand side and the peachy red box on the right-hand side. Anytime you're working with CSS Grid, it's a good idea to boot up the current document in the browser, open the developer tools, go to the layout panel, and make sure you can visualize the grid so you can see exactly what's going on. Right now, there are no active grids in our layout, and you can see the current layout is still this max width center aligned single column. If we go to stylemain.css and scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see how that is achieved. It's a single rule here that targets the site class. You'll remember the site class is appended to the body. And then it just says max width 50 ems and margin left and right auto. So this is just a standard method for creating a responsive single column layout that's always centered in the screen. The first thing we need to do is make sure our browser actually supports CSS Grid. And for that, we'll use a feature query. Looks like this, add support. And then we'll ask for support for grid area auto. And this code here asks the browser, hey, do you support the grid area auto feature? The browser will either say yes, in which case anything inside this feature query will run, or it'll say, I have no idea what you're talking about, in which case all the code inside this feature query will simply be ignored. Now, if you go online and you look for add supports and CSS Grid, you'll see a lot of people tell you to test for display grid. The reason why I use grid area auto instead is some older browsers actually have legacy support for an older spec for CSS Grid. So they will say yes to the question, do you support display grid? The problem is you don't know if that means they actually support the current spec or the older spec. But grid area is from the new current spec. So if we test for grid area instead, we will get a true answer. If the browser supports grid area, we can move forward. If it does not, then we should just ignore CSS Grid and move forward with our fallback instead. If the browser supports CSS Grid, we need to get rid of this site rule up here because we no longer want to restrict the width of the total content. So I'll say site, and then just counteract this max width by saying max width none, and save that. If you check this in the browser, you'll see now everything is full bleed. So that means if there are certain elements that we're not going to do anything else to, like this image, we don't actually have to apply a grid to it because it's already doing what we want. But when you scroll down, you see there's some pieces of content here that really need the grid, in particular these sections, the splash section, the buckets section, and the two sections below here. So there's still some work to be done. You'll remember from the intro movie to this chapter that we can't just apply a grid to the site rule so that there's one global grid for everything. Instead, we have to create a grid rule that applies to each of the sections individually, but uses the same rule for all of them, and then we can control the grid that way. To do that, we need to go take another look at the HTML structure and figure out exactly which elements we want to apply the grid to. So if we go down here, we find the site. Then we have the skip to content link and the masthead. And you already saw that this image here is already displaying as full bleed, so we don't have to do anything to that. Then we get the main section, and this is actually where we want to apply the grid. But we don't want to apply it to the main element. Instead, we want to set up a grid for each of the sections. Here we have the section splash, and then buckets, and more, and twins. Now, of course, I could go in here and create a rule that targets splash and buckets and more and twins. But since I already know that I'm going to apply this CSS rule to all of these sections, I'll instead just target main area and say, set up a rule for any direct descendant of main area. So main area, forward arrow, and asterisk. So that gives me all the first level descendants of main area. And then inside here, I'll say display, grid, and save it. Now when I go back to the browser, you'll see here we have a list of elements that have a grid to display. Section splash, section buckets, section more, and section twins. That just leaves the footer down here, which I also want to display as a grid. So back in index.html, I'll scroll down and find out what that is. And that is a footer with a class colophon. So I'll say here, comma, colophon, save again. And now we have 5 grid sections: splash, buckets, more, twins, and colophon. Now comes the challenging part. My design calls for a 4-column layout where the 2 center columns are the ones that constrain the content to a max width of 50 ems, and the 2 outer columns, so the first and the last column, work much the same as margin left and right auto in that they flex the available space on and off to center align everything else. To make matters a bit more complicated, at the very bottom we have these 2 twin boxes that span across 2 columns each, and we do the same for footer. To get this to work, we'll use a combination of the FR unit, the repeat keyword, and the min-max function. This is what it looks like. First, grid, template, columns. Then we'll set the first and the last column to 1 FR each, so they'll take up 1 fraction of the available space. So 1 FR. Then I'll repeat the 2 center columns, so I get 2 identical columns. Repeat, 2. And then I'll use the min-max function to set a max width for each of these 2 columns. Now the max width of the content should be 50 ems, so that means the max width should be 25 ems for each of the 2 columns. So I'll say min-max auto for when it's less than 25 ems, and then 25 ems as the max. End it all off with a 1 FR for that last buffer column. Save. And now when you go back to the browser, you'll notice everything looks really weird. All the content is now aligned all the way on the left-hand side, and my layouts look totally broken. That has an obvious explanation. Right now, the browser is auto-populating the grid and placing each grid item on the left-hand side. So the next step in the process is to realign the grid items to display within the right grid lines. So what I want to do here is display all the content between lines 2 and lines 4. Now, you can't even see line 4 here. Maybe we can see it up here. There it is. So line 2 is the beginning of the 2 center columns, and line 4 is the end of the 2 center columns. So this is where we want the main content to be displayed. Going back to index.html, we can find what we are targeting now. So the grid is being applied to section splash, section buckets, and so on. That means the grid items will be splash content, the UL, more content, and twin. So I'll go in here and create a new rule that targets those classes. Splash content, more content, buckets, UL. So these are the sections that will be center aligned in the 2 middle columns. So for these, I'll say grid column 2 to 4, meaning we start at line 2 and end at line 4. Then I'll grab twin, so that's each of the twins, and also colophon aside, so that's the 2 asides inside the footer section, and set grid column to span 2, so that each of these elements will span 2 columns. That should give us 2 boxes that each take up 50% of the total viewport width. Save this, go back in the browser, and now if we scroll up and down, you'll see here we have a full width image. Then we have this section where the content is confined to the center. We have the buckets section, same thing. We have the more section. And then at the bottom, we have the twin sections, each of which takes up 50% of the space, and the same with the footer. The last step in this process is to make sure everything looks good across all screen sizes. So as you can see here, on a wide screen, everything looks fine. But if I start narrowing the screen, we get to a certain point where the 3 flexed boxes take up the full available width, but our 2 boxes down here are still stacked one next to the other. And when I continue shrinking the width of the screen, it starts looking really strange. So I need to find the place where I want to toggle either just this particular section of the grid or the entire grid on and off. And in this case, because I'm only using the grid to create this full bleed layout, I might as well just toggle the entire grid section on and off, depending on whether or not I need it down here. So I've decided that 600 pixel wide is probably the point where I want these 2 boxes to appear next to one another. That means I'll go into my code in style main.css, and inside add supports grid area auto, I'll say add media, screen, and min width 600 pixels. And then just wrap my layout code inside that media query. Save that, go back in the browser. And now when we go below 600 pixels wide, the grid turns off and we get this nice single column layout. And when we increase to above 600 pixels, we first get the 2 boxes next to one another down here. And as we continue scaling up, we'll eventually get width restrictions for the main content, and we get exactly the kind of full bleed layout we want. Looking back at the code, you can see why CSS Grid is ideal for this type of layout. And not only is it simple, if you read the code, you should be able to understand what's going on. Of course, you could make it even easier to read by naming the lines or creating grid template areas. But in my case, the layout is so simple that that would just be extra code that's completely unnecessary. Bottom line is, the entirety of this grid layout consists of these 20 lines of code. Card layouts are a staple of web design and simplify the process of displaying arrays of similar items in a visually pleasing and easy to understand and interact with way. The challenge of card layouts is we have to preserve the visual consistency of cards even though they display different contents. In this chapter, we'll switch focus from overall page layouts to component level layouts by looking at some different card layouts and see how CSS Grid can help out. First, we'll look at some text-based cards with multiple pieces of information. Next, we'll build some cards that have text superimposed on top of images. And finally, we'll create an advanced dynamic grid-based card layout that displays various sized cards in a structured way. We have a lot of ground to cover here, so let's go. In this first example, we'll look at a text-based card, but technically the contents of this card could be anything: text, images, video, whatever you choose to add into the card. The purpose of this example is to show you how component-level grids make aligning contents inside cards easier. Right now, these cards have no grids inside them, and they're displayed the way they would be if you just applied standard styling. So this is our fallback. Now, you may wonder why you would want to display cards like this in a vertical stack on the full width of the screen. The reality is you wouldn't do this. You would add these cards into a larger layout that had maybe sidebars or something else. But here, we're just focusing on the cards themselves and how to create layouts with just the cards. So you can place those layouts anywhere else inside anything else later. The HTML structure of these cards is straightforward. We have a main with a class main area. This is where all the cards are sitting. And the cards themselves are sitting inside an unordered list with the class cards. Then each of the list items has a class card, and each of the list items contains a link that points nowhere. And inside that link, we have a time element. That's the month and date component. Then we have an h2 with the title, and then we have this div with the class meta that contains additional information. This content is repeated for each of the cards. So back here, you can see exactly how this works. When we hover over the card, it has this fancy hover effect, so you can see you're hovering over it. Same thing happens if you tab through the list. You see the date up here at the top, then we have the h2, and we have the div of the class meta that displays the meta information. What I want is a layout where the date appears on the left-hand side, and then the title and meta appear on the right-hand side, and I want everything to align nicely in the middle. Then I want to grab each of these cards and stack them first vertically in one single column, and then when the screen gets wider, in two columns next to one another, and then have each of the cards scale properly so that all the content fits the way it's supposed to. All of this is possible using CSS Grid. Let's start with the individual cards. Here I want the month and date to appear on the left-hand side as if they were inside a box, and then the title and meta description to appear on the right-hand side, one after the other. And I want all of this to center align vertically to make it all nice and tidy. Before Grid, the only way we could do this was by floating the month and date to the left, so encasing that in a container, then encasing the title and meta description in another container and floating that to the right, and then we'd use padding and margin and everything to get it to align. With Grid, we approach this problem very differently. Instead, we make each card a grid, and then we define 2 columns and 2 rows inside that grid and place the items on the grid. So the month and date are placed in the first column on the 2 rows. Then the title is placed in the second column on the first row, and the meta description is placed in the second column on the second row. To start this process, we need to define our grids. So we always start by checking to make sure the browser supports grid, add supports, grid area auto. Then we need to create grid containers for each element so we can target the elements inside as grid items. Looking at the HTML, you can see the items we want to place are the time elements, the h2, and the div of the class meta. And these are direct descendants of this anchor that sits inside the li with the class card. So the anchor here is what we need to make into a grid container. So card A, display grid. Then I'll set up 2 columns, one with a fixed width and one with an auto width. So grid template columns, and here I'll fix the width of the first column to 6 ems and set the second to auto. And finally, I want the 2 rows inside my grid to have equal height. So grid template rows, 1fr, 1fr. Now we can save this and go to the browser and take a look. So here, the layout of my card has changed. I have the month and date and also the meta content on the left-hand side and the title on the right-hand side. And if I select this element and inspect the grid, you'll see the grid here and you can see exactly what's happening. So the next step is to position these items where they're supposed to be. By now, you've already seen me place items on grids several times, but this time we're placing items in repeated grids, so it's worth covering one more time. First, I'll visualize my grid so I can see what's going on. Then I want the month and date to take up the entire first column, so both row 1 and 2. I want the title to take up the second column, and I also want to align it to the left. And I want the meta content to also take up the second column in row 2, and that should also align to the left. Finally, I need to realign these pieces of content vertically so that the title jams to the bottom line here and the meta content jams to the top. That way everything gets vertically centered. And while I'm at it, I might as well get rid of the padding on the left and the right-hand side because we don't need it. And you'll see that padding is sitting in the anchor element. So I'll do that first. Card A, padding, 0. Then I need to target the grid items. And back in index.html, you'll find them here. They are a time element with the class time, then an h2 element, and a div with the class meta. So I'll create rules for each of these 3 grid items. Time first. Set grid column, and here I want it to appear in the first column, and I want it to span the 2 rows available, so a grid row 1 to 3. I'll use the grid lines for this. Then we'll grab card h2, so that would be the h2 element, and I want that to appear in grid column 2 and grid row 1. And finally, we have meta. And meta also appears in grid column 2, and this time grid row 2. Save that, go back in the browser and reload, and now we have a much tighter display. But there are a couple of things that are a little bit wonky here. So first of all, the text is center aligned. I want it to be left aligned. And second of all, I need to do something with vertical alignments and other things. So let's do the text alignment first. I'll go back to card A and just say text align left. Save that. And then I need to experiment a bit with the width of the screen to see exactly what happens when I have less space. And what you notice here is when I reduce the width of the viewport, the date starts shifting over to the left-hand side and also sticks to the top. And the same thing is happening for the title up here. So I need to do something to center align this date vertically and horizontally, and then also make sure that the title always sticks to the bottom line in here. I can do that using Flexbox. So here I'm combining both grid and flex at the same time. So for the time element, after I've positioned it in the grid, I'll say display flex. This automatically just flexes the time. So now each of the 2 time items appear next to one another, which is absolutely not what I want. So I'll change the flex direction to column. So that will place them underneath one another. Then I want to align the items vertically and horizontally to the center. So I'll say align items center and justify content center. Save that. Go back into the browser, and now you see that for each of these date items, they're always hovering in the center regardless of the height of this element. The final thing I want to do is make sure that the title always jams to the bottom line here, and I can do that using a feature from Flex that also applies to items that are placed inside a grid. That is align self. So here I'll just say for card H2, align self flex end. And that ensures the item will always display to the end of this flexed box area, which is in this case a cell. So it'll always jam down to the bottom. The result of all this are flexible cards that look and behave exactly as I want them to. The next step is to place them in a grid so that they take up all the available space and use the space in the best possible way. So far in this chapter, we've been working at component level, treating each card as its own grid, and then placing the items inside the card on that grid for the layouts we want. Now we can take a step back and treat each of the cards as a grid item and place them on a larger grid to create full card layouts for wider viewports. The first step in this process is figuring out which container will be the grid container. And looking at the HTML, you can see each of the cards is a list item inside an unordered list. So the grid container needs to be this unordered list with a class cards. Here I need to introduce a media query because we only want to introduce this more advanced grid when the viewport is wide enough. So I'll start out by setting up a standard media query. I'll set a min width of 50 ems maybe, because I'm working on a small screen. And then I'll target cards and set up display, grid, and create 2 equal width columns. Save this, go back in the browser, and here we have a 2-column grid, but this looks really weird. So if I go up here to the cards and start the grid, you can see that the grid is intact and structured the way it's supposed to, but we have this extra space under each of these cards. There's this gray line here, but because of how the grid is laid out, you can see the grid rows are down here. I can see that the gray line is being created by the element inside this grid item. So that means the line is generated probably at the card level here, the list item, and it is. Here we have margin bottom 1em, and if I turn that off, the grid items line up nicely next to one another. So this is the thing I need to turn off, card margin bottom 1. So I'll go back in here, inside my media query, and target card, margin bottom 0. Save that and go back. Now that looks okay, but the grid still looks odd because we have this extra space here, and all the items are now stacked up right on top of one another, which is neat. I mean, this might be what you're looking for, but it's not what I'm looking for. I want a little bit of space between. So we'll create the space between first using grid gap, and then we'll resolve this problem of some of the items not being as tall as the other ones. So back here in cards, I'll set up grid gap to create a 1em gap between each of the cells. That creates a nice gritty grid that has proper gutters between each of the items. So now everything is looking pretty good. And then I need to deal with this item and some of the other ones that are not spanning the full height of the available row. So why is this happening, you may ask? Well, the answer is simple. This item over here is physically taller than this one. And since we haven't specified anything about whether or not this item here should stretch the full available space, it doesn't. It just displays itself with the current height. So I need to target the card element here, the list item, and then try to get it to stretch the full height of the available space. And the way to do that is by using flex. So I'll grab the card rule and I'll say display, flex. By setting the display property of card to flex, we're telling any item inside the card element to take up all the available vertical space. And the item inside the card element is the anchor. So now the actual clickable area will take up the full vertical space. But this brings up another problem. You can see this card here and this one here are not taking up the full horizontal space anymore. Well, that's easy enough to fix. We go to card A. So that's the anchor, and then say width 100%. That extends the width of each of these flexed items to the total available width, and we get items that fill out the entire cell. Back in my style sheet, I have to go to card, display, flex, and then set up a new rule for card A and set width to 100%. Save that, go back in the browser, and now there's only one problem left. You can kind of see it here. You probably saw it better before. There's no padding inside this element, and that means there's a good chance that the text inside either the H2 or the meta element might butt up against the right-hand edge of the card. That will look weird, so we should try to avoid that. So back here in my style sheet, I'll go down outside the media query, find card A, and just add a padding to the right-hand side of 1em. So padding 0, 1em, 0, 0. Save that. Go back in the browser one final time. And now when I hover over the anchor element, you can see there's padding on the right-hand side, making sure the text never butts up against the right-hand side, and everything is laying out nicely in the grid I want. In this next example, we'll take what we learned building the text-based card layout to create an image gallery that uses figures and fig captions and has some fancy interactive effects. And we'll do all of this using Grid. In the exercise files for this movie, you'll find HTML and CSS that looks very similar to what we've been working with so far. In the HTML, we have a main with the class main area, a UL with the class cards, and inside that UL, we have all the cards. They each sit in a list item with the class card item. That list item contains an anchor, then a figure with a class card, and inside this figure, we have the image and the fig caption. In the style sheet, I've already set up the styles for the grid layout for the entire page because that's no different from what we worked with in the previous movie. This is just a standard 2-column grid for medium screens and 4-column grid for wide screens. Right now, this is what it looks like in the browser. Each figure is its own card, and in each figure we have an image and the fig caption. When you hover your mouse over the image or tab to it with your keyboard, the box behind the fig caption highlights and you can easily read what it says. And then when we widen the viewport, we go to a 2-column layout with a grid gap between the rows and columns, and then eventually a 4-column layout. What I want to do now is change the behavior of these images when we are on wider viewports. So instead of the fig caption appearing below the image, I want the fig caption to appear only when we hover or focus on an image and then appear on top of the image instead. That way we get a much tighter grid, and when you're looking at it without interacting with any of the elements, you just see the images. This stacking text on top of images thing is nothing new in web design, but in the past, to do it, we had to first relatively position the figure, then position the text absolutely on top of the image, and then mess around with the code to get it to position where we want it to. Now with Grid, this process is way easier. And once you see how it's done, you also realize there's a ton of stuff you can do using this exact same technique. So although I'm going to show you a very simple example, what you'll see here is that stacking content using CSS Grid is incredibly simple and allows you to do all sorts of crazy things. So let's get this to work. Here's how we're going to stack the fig caption on top of the image. First, we'll grab the figure element and turn it into a grid container. That turns the image element and the fig caption into grid items, and then we can just position each of these in the same cell. As a result, they'll stack one on top of another based on the HTML source order, so the image will be in the back and the fig caption will be in the front. And this fig caption has a semi-transparent background, so you'll be able to see the image through this purple background. Here's what that looks like in CSS. First, we grab the figure element, which has the class card, and set display grid. Then we'll grab the 2 elements inside the card. We can do that by either saying card and then star, or by targeting card, image, and caption. Then we set grid column 1 and grid row also 1. Save that and go back in the browser. And the caption now stacks right on top of the image and fills out all the available space. This is pretty much as easy as it could be, and it's much easier than the old method of using absolute positioning. This opens up a whole host of new opportunities that were previously pretty much unavailable because, although I'm stacking just 2 elements on top of another, you can stack as many elements as you like doing this exact same thing. And you can control the order of those elements either through the source order in the HTML or by using the Z-index property in CSS. And then you can even manipulate the order using Z-index and JavaScript. So here, there are tons of new design and layout and interaction opportunities that previously were pretty much impossible to do. Just to expand that even further, right now I'm just using a single cell. You can do this across an entire grid. Place items that overlap 1 cell or 2 cell or multiple cells, then use transparency to shine through, change the source order of elements or change the Z-index of elements, and create really interesting new designs, all by stacking one piece of content on top of the other. This truly is something completely new, completely different, and it's very, very easy to do, all thanks to CSS Grid. Now that the cards are stacking the way they're supposed to, we can turn our attention to stylistic elements. So there are a couple of things I want to change here, and there's also a pesky problem that needs to be resolved. The first change is I want to move the fig caption from the top of the box down to the bottom. And this is a perfect example of where Grid and Flexbox work really well together. Grid ensures that the caption takes up the full available space inside the cell, so it's spanning all the way from the top to the bottom. Now I can use Flex and align items to align the actual text to the bottom of the Flexbox without changing the span of this box. So I'll grab the fig caption class caption, find the rule for it down here, and then say display flex. And then I'll use align items and set align items to flex end. That grabs any item inside the Flexbox and just positions it at the end of the Flexbox, which is at the bottom. Clean, straightforward, and only 2 lines of CSS. So I'll copy that out, go into my style sheet and create a new rule for a caption, and paste it in, save, and make sure it still works in the browser. All right, so far so good. The next thing I want to do is change the behavior of the images when we hover over them. Right now, you can't really see the image when it's not being hovered or focused on because we have this overlay on top of it. So I want to change that by changing the behavior of this background. The background is generated by the fig caption element. You can see here in the rule for a caption that we have the background color, and we're using HSLA. So there's an alpha layer that's at 0.6. This is what's causing the transparency. I can change it so you can see. If I set it to 0.2, it's almost not there at all. If I set it to 0.9, it's almost solid. So it's currently at 0.6. Then, when you go to the anchor element and hover or focus over it, and then select the fig caption, you'll see up here that the color has been changed to an alpha of 1. So this is what makes it solid. And what causes this fading effect here, you can see it's fading in and out, is the transition property set on caption. So here's what I want to happen. When we're not interacting with the images, I don't want to see the caption at all. It should just be blank. And then when we interact with the image, either by hovering over it or touching it or focusing on it with a keyboard, we should get this transparency to appear and then also the text to appear. So we'll never see this solid purple. Instead, we'll have the transparent purple fade in and fade out. That means I need to change the behavior of these elements just inside my media query. So first, I'll hide the caption, and I'll do that by setting its opacity value to 0. Then I need to bring that opacity all the way up to 1 when we hover over or focus on the element, because now we've faded out the entire caption element. So that's both the background and the text. So I'll say A, focus, and then caption, or a hover caption. That targets both circumstances. And then I'll set opacity to 1. Save that, go back in the browser. Let's see how that works. So now when I'm not interacting with the image, you just see the image. Then when I hover over it, we fade the background all the way in, and now the background is solid. So that means, and I need to change the value for this background color. And you can see it sitting right here in the browser. This is the one with the HSLA set to 0.6 alpha. So I'll just copy that and paste it into this rule. So that means once we fade in the caption, we're setting the background of the caption to 0.6 alpha. Go back in the browser, hover over the element, and now we're fading in that nice transparent background, and everything is looking clean and exactly like what I want. That just leaves my pesky problem, and this is really an annoying problem when you're working with grid. You've seen something similar before. Whenever we're working with grid, we're working with rigid rows and columns. And when we're positioning things like an image element inside the grid, like what I've done now, we can take advantage of things like a background image, spanning, and then just cutting it off. So as a result, there are times when an image may not be the right size, and as a result, we get these gaps underneath. This is not an easy problem to solve because you'd either have to then expand the image size or stretch it in some way, and that looks really weird. You also may encounter this if you put too much content on top of it. So one of the elements that's stacked in the stack will increase the height or width of the overall cell. So when you're starting to work with this type of layering, you have to be very careful about how you format the content you put into the design. And the solution here is a little bit annoying, but also really straightforward. Make sure that all the images in your layout are formatted for the exact same height and width. The problem I'm having here is that this one item is not the same size as the other ones. To fix it, I'll go into index.html. I have already cheated and made the right size image. So I'll find it right here, the tree image. I'll switch it to the tree crop image. Save. Go back in the browser. Now all the images have the same size, and as a result, the grid is consistent. It's a weird fix, but it's a fix that's necessary if you want to work with grids and do exactly what I'm doing here. Let me show you one more thing before we move on to the next example. Looking at this layout we have right now, I'm sure you're thinking, this is cool and all, but it's starting to look really boring, especially when we start widening the viewport. This is about as rigid of a grid as you can get, and hardly inspirational unless you're making some sort of image gallery. You want something a little more dynamic, right? Where the images have different sizes and different things happen. Well, using CSS Grid, that's actually pretty straightforward. If I go into my style sheet and then find the media query for this wide area where we have 4 columns, I can create a new rule, call it double. And then inside the rule, I'll say grid column span 2 and grid row span 2. That means any element that has the double class appended to it will now span 2 columns and 2 rows. Then I, of course, have to apply that to one of these elements. So I'll go in here and maybe add it to the first one. So I'll just call li class card item double, save, go back in the browser. And now the first item takes up twice as much space as the other items. And what you see is it takes up exactly twice as much space. Everything aligns really nicely in the grid. So it looks good on the first item. What happens if I put it on the second item instead? Well, we just get the second item instead, and the available space is filled out. So now you can start experimenting with where you want this grid item to appear and how you want it to appear, and you can create these very dynamic grids based on how the grid is laid out. So you can create different rules for different viewport widths, and you can create different rules for the number of items you're displaying, and so on and so forth. This is one of the great advantages of using a grid properly, that you can now decide exactly where you want to position things and how they relate to one another, and which items just take up 1 cell or 2 cells or 3 cells. And you're not restricted to just doing this for 2 columns and 2 rows. You can do it for just 2 rows or just 2 columns or something else, and you'll see that in the next example. To wrap up this chapter, we'll take everything we've covered so far in this course and smash it all together into one page. What I want to do here is create an advanced grid-based card layout that displays different cards in different sizes and displays the content in the best possible way across all screen widths. What you have in the exercise files for this movie is the starting point for this layout. So on smaller screens, you'll see a full bleed image with some text underneath. There's a slight hover effect behind the text, and that also works for focus. Then as we scale up the width of the screen, this full bleed image and everything centers on the screen, and we get this outline around the box when we hover or focus over it. This is an actual outline, it's not a border, so we're using the outline property for it. That way nothing is moving around when it kicks in and out. And then if I keep widening the viewport, nothing happens. What I want to do here is create a layout that takes full advantage of the available space, uses a grid, and showcases some items more than others. And just for reference, this layout is based on the Twitter Moments page. So if you want to go look at that first, you'll get an idea of where we're going. And then you'll see when we come back here how easy it is to build this type of layout using CSS Grid. So let's put it all together right now. Just like before, in the exercise files for this movie, you'll find all the markup in index.html. We don't have to touch that. The structure of the markup is pretty much identical to what we've been working with so far in this chapter. There are no surprises, nothing weird. And here at the bottom of style main.css, I've set up a media query just to constrain the content to make it work the way it's supposed to now. And there's also a media query ready for when we have a wider screen and we want to use the grid. And all of this is wrapped inside our @supports rule. So this only kicks in if the browser supports grid. Otherwise, you just get that nice center-aligned images and text and nothing else. The first thing I want to do is turn these cards, which currently take up way too much vertical space, into horizontal cards with the image on the left-hand side and the text on the right-hand side. To do that, we'll target the card element, which in this case is a figure with a class card. So here, inside the first media query, I'll say card, display, grid. And then I'll set up a 2-column layout, grid, template, columns. the first column will be 8 ems wide, and the second column will be flexible, so auto. Save that, go back in the browser, and just like that, we have a really nice horizontal card. Because we're operating with an image and a fig caption here, we don't even need to place anything on the grid. It just automatically places where it's supposed to be. And if you change the text position of this page, the image will appear on the right with the text on the left automatically. So this is about as easy as it can get. The next step is to introduce a 2-column layout once the viewport gets wide enough. That's done in the media query down here, min width 60 ems. And here I first need to convert the container that holds all the cards into a grid container. That's this one here, UL with the class cards, just like before. So I'll say cards. And then before I do anything else, I want to get rid of this max width and center alignment that's currently happening. If you go look in the CSS, you'll see this entire section here has a rule that says cards max width 25 ems, and then margin is set to auto on the left and right. So this is good old-fashioned center alignment with max width content. We're going to take that away right now. So I'll say max width none, and margin 1em and 0. Then we'll define a grid. And we'll set up 2 equal width columns that are each 25 ems wide. Then, to make sure the items don't butt up against each other, we'll set up a grid gap of 1em. And finally, we'll use justify content center to center align the grid inside the container. Back in the browser, what we get is this really nice grid layout where each card is displayed next to the other card, and everything looks nice and calm and really boring. We also notice that there's a lot of space between each of these items. So if I go and inspect one of the items, you'll see here that this card element has margin 1 set to it, and that was done up in the higher media query. So now that we're in this grid layout, we should probably turn that off. So I'll go down here and say card, margin 0. That gives us a much tighter grid, but it's still very structured and kind of boring. So we're going to break this apart a bit and put focus on some elements by making them a lot bigger. What I want to do here is grab maybe the first element or another element and display this item across 3 rows. So 1 column, but 3 rows. And I want the image to appear at the top and the text underneath. I'll do that using the double class we used previously in the course. And I've already added the double class to 2 elements in the HTML. So if I create a new rule down here and target double, it'll automatically apply to just those 2 elements. So in the double rule, I'll say grid row span 3. Save that. Go back in the browser, and now you can see that first element is trying to span 3 rows, but it can't because it's the size of all the other elements. That's easy enough to fix. The double class is applied to the list item. Then if we grab this figure inside it and then change its display, which is currently grid, back to block, then everything should just realign top to bottom the way it used to be. So I'll say double, card, displaying, block, save, go back in the browser, and here we have the exact layout I was looking for. Now the first item is a large featured item that takes up 3 full rows. So here we have a huge image and then the text underneath. Next to it, aligned properly on the grid, we have 3 other items. Then as I scroll down, more items align to the left and right. And then we have another featured item, this time on the right-hand side, with all the other items floating up next to it or underneath it. And as a result, we get this really dynamic layout that really showcases content in a new and interesting way. Looking at this, there's a good chance you have a specific question, so I might as well answer it. Why did you choose to fix the width of the content like you did? So you see here, when we're on a medium screen, I've fixed the width of the content so that these layouts are exactly the same. And then when I scale up, it snaps. And then we get this more complex layout. Now, you don't have to do this. You can choose to make it fully fluid and dynamic. But anytime you're doing something where you're aligning an image next to text elements and you're not using a background image, that will at some point result in the image resizing, or you're going to get empty space either underneath or above the image or something like that. So if you're making a layout that looks like this, where you're using images as part of the layout and you want to tightly control exactly how everything is displayed, it's a good idea to fix the total width of your grid at any one time so you have full control. The good news is this can be used to your advantage, because right now in my screen, which is relatively small, I only have room for 2 columns. But there's no reason why when you're on a wider screen, you can't have room for more. So you can choose to create completely different layouts for these elements depending on how much space is available in the viewport. That's kind of the beauty of CSS Grid. Because you're working solely with CSS, there's no custom HTML or JavaScript going on here, you can provide custom layouts for all sorts of different viewport widths and create custom experiences that present the content in the best possible way, no matter how wide or narrow the screen is. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on in this layout, and now that you've seen it, I encourage you to dig through all the code and figure out how all these pieces work. And then in the next chapter, we'll take CSS Grid to the next level. CSS Grid opens the door to new layout and design opportunities, and it also greatly simplifies some old staples of web design. In this chapter, we'll combine everything covered in this course into a web page and add a new interactive feature to it, an accessible off-canvas navigation that reveals itself when interacted with using touch, mouse, or keyboard interaction. We'll build 2 variations of this off-canvas navigation. In the first example you see here, the navigation panel will slide in on top of the page content. Once it's slid in, you can navigate through it. Then if you click either on the menu button or outside the menu area, the navigation collapses again. You can also access this using the Tab key on your keyboard. Here you see focus on the menu button, and when I select it, the menu opens and I can navigate through the menu items. In the second navigation, the navigation panel slides in from the left, shifting the right side of the page content out of view. So you're effectively shifting the entire page instead of covering content from the page. Both these navigation panels are fully accessible, and in both cases, the menu items are only accessible via keyboard navigation when the menu is open. If you test either one of these using a screen reader, you'll also discover this menu button up here calls out the status of the navigation panel anytime you focus on it. These off-canvas design patterns are not new. What is new is how easy it is to implement them using CSS Grid, and how, thanks to CSS Grid, we don't have to create any unnecessary nesting or grouping in the HTML document to make this happen. Both these examples use the exact same HTML and JavaScript. The only difference between them is how the grids are laid out and how we position the different grid items on those grids. Like with every other example, we'll start with a mobile-first non-grid layout where everything is fully accessible. You can see here. Then we'll progressively enhance the layout for browsers that have support for grid and viewports that are wide enough for this layout to make sense. Are you ready? Good. Let's get cracking. Just like with the earlier chapters, I've taken a page out of the TV Chef cookbook here and started the project for us to save some time. If you open the exercise files for this movie in your browser, you'll find a page that is quite similar to what we had at the end of the previous chapter. We have a header and the advanced responsive card-based layout using CSS Grid in the middle. And what's new here is there's also a navigation section below the header. And if we scroll down, we have a sidebar and then the footer. Looking at index.html, you'll find clean, structured, and semantic HTML without any unnecessary containers or nesting divs. Just like before, we have a body with a class site that contains our skip to content link. Then there's a header with a class mastheader. That's the header. We have a section with a class main and nav, and this is the navigation. Inside here, we have a button that will become the trigger to open and close the menu, as well as the nav itself that holds the menu. Scrolling down, we have a main with the ID content and the class main area. This is where you find the cards and the card items. This is what we covered in the previous chapter. Below the main, we have a section, class sidebar, and this contains those 2 twin asides we worked with in a previous chapter, even before the last one. And finally, we have the footer. So as you can see, all these main sections are direct descendants of the body element with the class site. So that means if we create a rule for the body element and class site that contains a CSS grid, all these main sections become grid items. In the style sheet, the only things worth noting at the moment is the CSS rules for the card-based layout you'll find all the way at the bottom of style main.css. These are pretty much identical to what we've worked with in the previous chapter, so I won't discuss this in any more detail. Here's what we're going to do. For this layout, we'll create a main grid that has one column on medium screens and two columns on wide screens, so the sidebar can shift up here to the right-hand side. Then we'll grab the navigation area and change the menu so it displays as a vertical list. And then we'll position the navigation panel in the top left cell on top of the other content and use traditional positioning to shift it off screen to the left. Finally, we'll hook some JavaScript to a button to add and remove a class from the body element, and then we'll use that class to point to a rule, which reveals the menu by shifting it back into view on top of the other content. The main takeaway here is how we can use CSS Grid to stack content and then use that stacking to create interactive experiences. We'll start off by creating our main grid and positioning the grid items on that grid using grid template areas. Just as a reminder, the grid container is this body element with a class site. I already have some media queries down here at the bottom that we're using for the cards layout, so I'll just extend these media queries. So here inside the min-width 27M media query, I'll create a new rule for site, display grid, and then set up a grid template area property. And here I'm going to create grid template areas even though I'm working with a single column. So at the very top, I want a header. Next, I want the main. Then I want the sidebar. And finally, I want the footer. You'll notice that I'm not listing out the nav here. That's because we're going to superimpose the nav on top of some other content later on. So let's just leave that for now. Then I need to actually position each of my grid items in the grid using these grid template areas. So I'll grab each of them in turn. First, masthead. That's the header. So we'll set that to grid area header. The next item is main area. We'll set that to grid area main. Then we have sidebar, grid area sidebar, and finally colophon, which is the footer, grid area footer. If you save this and go back to the browser, you'll notice the only thing that's changed is the navigation is no longer at the top here. In fact, the navigation has now been shifted all the way down to the bottom below all the other content because the navigation is the only thing that has not been positioned yet. That's exactly what we want. The next step is to create a media query that will shift the sidebar up to the right-hand side when we have enough space. Now, in the exercise files, there is a media query at 60 ems, but 60 ems is not wide enough to allow the sidebar to appear on the side. So we're going to create a new media query that's even wider. We'll do that down here at media screen and min width 78 ems. That's pretty much as wide as my monitor. Ideally, I would actually make it wider, but then I can't show it to you. So in my very restricted environment, it's going to be 78 ems. In this new media query, I'll create a new rule for site. In this rule, I'm already inheriting the display grid. So all I have to do is set up new columns and then changing the grid template areas. So I'll say grid template column is auto for the first column. That's where the cards and everything else go. And then 15 ems for the sidebar. So we have a fixed width for the sidebar. Then I'll set up grid template areas. And here in the first row, I want to display header. In the second row, I want to display main and sidebar. And in the third row, I want to display footer and footer. We've already set the grid area properties for each of the items, so they'll just naturally position themselves on this new grid. Save that, go back in the browser, and now on a wide screen, you'll see the sidebar popping up to the right-hand side, whereas every other part of the grid remains the same. So now all the main pieces are in place, except for the menu, which is still stuck down here. That's what we'll address next. Now comes the fun part. We're going to take this nav section down here at the bottom and pull it out and place it on top of the other content on the left-hand side here. In the past, this would require absolute positioning and a bunch of CSS magic, but now that we're using CSS Grid, it is totally straightforward. As you know, once you've defined a grid, you can take any grid item and place it anywhere you want in the grid. And in this case, we're going to take the nav grid item, place it in the first column, and make it span across all the available rows. Just to make it easier for you to follow along, I'll place my browser on the right and the code editor on the left. The item we're targeting is this section here with the class main_nav, and inside the section we have a button with a class trigger that's currently hidden with CSS, as well as a nav that has the actual menu. This nav UL here is currently using Flexbox to align the items horizontally, and that will come into play a little later on. The first thing we need to do is move the entire nav section up above all the other content and into the position where we want it. So far, we've positioned all the other items using grid template areas, but because we're positioning this item on top of everything else, we're going to just use the grid lines instead. All of this will happen from the medium screen onwards, so I'll work inside our first media query, and here I'll target main nav, so that's the overall container, and I'll set its grid column property to 1, because we want it in the first column, and grid row, we need to set it so it spans across all the available rows. And if we look up here in grid template areas, you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means we have grid row lines 1 through 5 to span all the vertical rows. Save that, and the navigation area pops into the correct position. But now you notice something else, that because of HTML source order, it's still displaying below the other content. So here are my cards. And if I scroll down, you can see the sidebar and the footer, and all of those are stacked on top of this nav area. To fix this, we need to change the Z index position of this item. And the easiest way to do that is to just relatively position main and nav. So position relative. We'll also use this a little later on. Save that. Now the menu appears on top. Of course, now it's covering everything, and that's not what we want. So we need to restrict its width to 12 ems. Then I want the menu to appear as a vertical menu. And like I explained before, this menu is laid out using flex. So that means we can just change the flex direction of the menu, and then it'll appear as a vertical list. So I'll go in and grab main nav UL and set flex direction to column. Save that. Now we have a nice vertical column. Then I want to display this trigger button up here on the right-hand side next to the other content. Now, like I explained, the trigger button is currently being hidden using CSS, just display set to none. So now that we're in a media query where we actually want the trigger button to appear, I'll create a new rule for trigger, set display to block, and save that. Then the trigger button appears here. And here I've used a rotate transform, so it rotates sideways like this. Then I need the trigger to move over to the edge. So I'll position it, and I'll actually use a fixed position for this. That means it'll be pulled out of the context, and it'll also stick to the same location no matter what I do. And then finally, I have to actively position it. So here I'm just going to experiment with some widths. So I'll say top 1.5 ems and left 14.5 ems. And the result is the menu button now appears as a tag on the right-hand side of the navigation area. Of course, the menu is now positioned on top of all the other content permanently, which is not what we want at all. So in the next movie, we'll look at how to move it off canvas without breaking everything. The next step is to grab the entire navigation area plus this menu button here and shift it to the left so it shifts off canvas. And we can do this by simply changing the left position of these items because they're relatively positioned inside the grid. And that means if we shift them to the left, it doesn't expand the width of the available content in the viewport, so we don't get left and right scrolling. Let me show you what I mean. If I go into the main nav rule here and simply say left minus 13 em and click save, you'll see this nav area shift over to the left-hand side. Still a little bit of it peeking out because there's some padding on this element. That's why we can shift it to 13 to the left, even though it's only 12 ems wide. But the important thing is we don't have horizontal scroll bars. So this is literally shifted off canvas without changing the width of the grid at all. We're relatively positioning it away from its original position without changing the grid. Of course, we can't just do this with the main nav. We also have to do it with the trigger button. So right now, the trigger button is set to left 14.5. I'm going to comment that out because we'll need that number later. And instead, I'll try a different value, maybe left 0.1 m or something like that, and see what happens. Maybe 0.2 m, 0.5 m, nope, 0.2. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so now the menu is shifted off to the left-hand side, and I can scroll up and down, and you see it sticks to the left-hand side the whole way through, but now I don't have access to the menu. So now I need a way of revealing it again. That's next. In the previous movie, we moved the navigation panel off screen using relative positioning and the left property. That means moving it back into its original position is a matter of resetting this left property. This needs to be done both for the main nav element and for the fixed trigger button, since it's fixed to the viewport, not the main nav element. The cleanest way of making this happen is to use JavaScript to toggle a class on the body element depending on whether the navigation area is hidden or displayed. Let's call that class Reveal. If the Reveal class is present, the left property of main nav is reset to 0. At the same time, the left property of the trigger is set to 14.5. You'll remember this is the value we figured out when we were positioning the items to display on top of the other content earlier. So I'll grab that from the original code, paste it down here, and take away the comments. Now I can go over to my browser and just experiment to see that this actually works. So I will grab the body element here and append the class Reveal to it. And here you can see the menu and the menu button reveal itself. The Reveal class should be toggled on and off when the trigger button up here is pressed. And if the nav area is open, it should also be toggled off if the visitor uses keyboard navigation to navigate out of the nav area and into the main content, or uses touch or mouse to click outside the nav area. All of this is accomplished using the JavaScript provided in the exercise files for this movie under the file functions.js. At the start of the script, you'll find some constants and a let to point at different elements in the document. These are site, which points to the body element with the class site, trigger, which points to the trigger button, reveal, which points to the main nav area, so that's the entire main panel, menu items, which points at all the menu items inside the nav, and menu array, which grabs menu items and turns them into an array. And then finally, a let called screen reader text that grabs the text inside the screen reader text span inside the button. So this is only available for screen readers. Below these variables are 3 functions. The first one toggles the Reveal class on and off on the body element and updates the ARIA expanded attribute and screen reader text on the trigger button using ternary operators. The second triggers Reveal menu when focus shifts away from the menu, so effectively closes the menu when it's not in use by keyboard navigation. And the third captures click events and triggers the Reveal menu function above if the nav area is currently revealed and the click happens anywhere outside the navigation area. These 3 functions are called using 3 event handlers. The first one listens for a click on the trigger buttons and triggers the Reveal menu function to show and hide the nav area. The second listens for any focus change and triggers catch focus to hide the menu when it's not in focus. And the third listens for any click and triggers the click target function to see if that click is outside the main area. Put all of this together and we get a menu that reveals itself when the menu button is clicked and hides when it's clicked again. We can also target this menu using the keyboard and open and close it. And if we open the menu and tab through the items, I can navigate up and down. But if I tab outside the menu, it automatically collapses. The same thing happens if I open the menu and click anywhere else within the view, it automatically collapses. So now we have all the functional components for this overlay menu. To finish off the menu, we need to add 2 more features, and they both have to do with accessibility. The first one has to do with keyboard navigation. So if you listen closely, you can hear me tab through the different items on this view. That's the skip to content link. The next one is the menu button. And then here, I'm navigating inside the main menu. The problem is you can't see what I'm doing right now. If you were using a screen reader, you would actually get the menu items read out to you. But I'm not using a screen reader. I'm looking at the screen. So right now I can't see the focus. Only when I tab past the menu do I get into the content I can actually see. And here my focus has shifted to the first card item. This is an accessibility problem for two reasons. The first one, if you are using a visual browser, you can't see what's going on, and it seems as if the tab button isn't doing anything. The second problem is if you are using a screen reader and you want to skip the menu, you can't because currently the menu is open. To fix this, we will hide the main nav UL when it's not revealed, and then we will show it just like we've been showing the main nav and the trigger. So here in the rule for main nav UL, I'll say display none. So that is when we load the page and everything is by default. Then I'll set up a new rule below and say reveal main nav UL display flex. Save that, go back and reload the browser. And now when I hit the tab key, I first get the skip to content link, then get the menu button, and then get the first focusable item in the card stack. To get to the menu items with the keyboard, I first have to trigger the menu button. That opens the menu, and then I can get to each of the menu items using the keyboard, just like I should. And if I tab out of it, the menu collapses, and now if I tab back, I get to the menu button. So now the menu is accessible to both keyboard users and touch or mouse users. The next accessibility issue has to do with scrolling. So if I open the menu and I scroll up and down, you'll notice the menu also scrolls up and down. And that means if I open the menu and I'm halfway down the page, I don't actually see the menu. This is a relatively simple fix. We go back into main nav. Here it says display none. And then above that, we'll just say position fixed. This will fix the main nav UL in relation to the outermost container. And as a result, when I scroll, the main nav is now fixed on the top left-hand side. And because this is all sitting inside our media query and inside the supports rule for Grid, this will not impact the smaller screens or browsers that do not support Grid in any way. So now we have a fully accessible off-screen menu that covers content on reveal and uses CSS Grid for simple and clean CSS. In the previous example, we created an off-canvas menu that floated in to place itself on top of the other content. We did this by drawing a grid, wrapping all the content, then manually positioning the navigation panel grid item in the same column as the main content and sliding it off canvas using relative positioning and the left property. In this next example, we'll do something different. Here, when the navigation panel slides in from the left, the other content slides out of canvas on the right-hand side of the viewport. To achieve this, we'll create a two-column layout where the first column is the width of the navigation panel, and the second column takes up the full viewport width minus 1em to allow the navigation panel to peek out on the left-hand side. This gives us a total grid that is wider than the viewport, which will cause horizontal scrolling. To prevent that, we'll set the overflow X property to hidden so the browser ignores anything overflowing. Then we'll set the position property of the entire grid to relative and shift the entire grid to the left. In short, instead of moving the navigation panel relative to the grid, we move the grid relative to the viewport. Got that? Okay, let's get to work. In the exercise files for this movie, you'll find the exact same example we've been working with so far in this chapter. The only thing I've changed is the title. So it's now called Shift In Off-Canvas Navigation. That's because we're going to have the navigation shift in from the left and then have the other content shift out to the right. So we're shifting the entire view. Right now, though, the menu is sliding out on top of the other content just like it did before. So that means I need to make some changes. And here I'm going to employ my favorite development tool, which is being lazy. I want to do as little as humanly possible to make this happen. And that means I'm not touching the HTML. I'm not touching the JavaScript. All I'm doing is changing the grid layout and where things are positioned within the grid because CSS Grid allows me to do that. Here's what that looks like. First, I need to create a new column for my menu. And I'll do that at the first media query here at 27M. So we've already displayed a grid, and that means I can set up grid template columns. The first column will be 15 ems wide, and this is where the navigation panel will appear. And then for the second column, I want to take the entire width of the viewport and then just subtract 1 em so that this first column peaks out a little bit. That should result in a grid that is as wide as the viewport plus 14 ems, so we'll get something that's bigger than what we see. I'll use the calc method for this, so I'll say calc 100%. You could use VW2 if you wanted to, but that would cause problems with the scroll bar, so 100% works fine in this case, minus 1 em. That gives me 2 columns. Then I need to position the navigation panel inside the first column, and I'll do that using grid template areas. So I'll create a new area called nav, set it across all 4 rows. Then I have to position an item in this new nav area, and we have a rule for that item already. It's down here, main nav. It's currently positioned for the menu item to appear on top of the other content, so I'll take all that stuff out and instead say grid area nav. Then at the very bottom of my style sheet, I also have to account for this wider screen scenario where we used to have 2 columns. So here we used to display the main content on the left with an auto width, and then the sidebar on the right with a 15em width of the column. So I need to add in my 15em column here for the navigation, then leave the 15ems in place for the sidebar, and change the middle part here so that I take the full width, that would be 100%, and then I subtract the 1 em so that I get the menu to peek out, and 15 ems, so I account for the space the sidebar takes up. That means calc 100% minus 16 ems. Down in grid template areas, I also have to add in the nav area again. So nav across all 3 rows. Save that, go back in the browser, and now the nav area appears on the left-hand side. Then we have the main content, and then if we scroll to the right, you'll see the sidebar. You may be wondering, where is the actual menu? Well, you have to click on the menu for it to appear, right? Because technically, when we load the page, the menu shouldn't be there. It only appears once we interact with it. So what we're seeing here is the revealed state of the menu. So far, so good. At this point, my grid is exactly 14 ems wider than the available viewport. And if you change the width of the viewport, you'll notice that it's still always wider than the available viewport. As a result, we get horizontal scrolling. And it's this horizontal scrolling we'll use to create this reveal function. So basically, when we load the view, we want to see this, where the menu is over here on the left-hand side and hidden away from the canvas. And then when you click the menu button, we want the scroll action to happen. The menu slides in on the left-hand side and the content slides out on the right. But I want to do this without actually having the scroll bar at the bottom to ruin everything. For this, we can use a really simple trick. We just tell the browser to ignore anything that's outside of the viewport. So back in my style sheet, here in the site rule, I'll say overflow x, so that would be the x-axis, the horizontal axis, hidden. Save that. Go back in the browser and reload the page, and now the scroll bar is gone, but then we can't get access to the sidebar. So if we go in here and inspect this element, and then go up to the body element here, create a new rule just for site, and say position relative, and then left minus 2em, you'll see stuff starts shifting left, and if I keep going down, we'll be able to shift the content back into view. And this technique should be very familiar to you because this is exactly what we did in the previous example. We shifted some content off canvas without creating a wider canvas in the process. So here we're going to do the exact same thing. That means I need to move position relative and left 14 over into my style sheet. So position relative left minus 14 ems. Go back and reload, and now the menu is sliding over here on the left-hand side, and we can see all our content, including the sidebar, on the right-hand side. Then we'll take advantage of the existing behavior that came from the JavaScript that we've just inherited from the previous project. You'll remember in this JavaScript, we find the site element and toggle the reveal class on the site element when the button is pressed. So that means I should be able to just say reveal, because the reveal class is already appended to the site element, and left 0. Then scroll down and find other reveal rules, like this reveal main nav left 0. We don't need that one anymore. And the reveal main nav UL, that one is fine because that's the one that displays the menu. And finally, this reveal trigger. Probably need to make some changes to that one too, but we'll leave that alone for now. Save, go back in the browser. And the JavaScript is already running because it was inherited from the previous chapter. And that means I should be able to click the menu button and see the menu appear. Click it again, it disappears. And all the other behavior is also being inherited. So here you can see click outside, everything slides off. Tab through the elements and tab out, everything slides off. Select the menu, I can now tab through everything. Select the menu again, it drops back. And really the only thing I need to change now is to make sure this menu button doesn't have a space between it and the menu section. So I'll go in here and find the menu button on reveal and just change it to 14 ems exactly. There, now the menu button sticks where it's supposed to, and everything is working as expected. Did you think there would be more to this? I'm sorry to disappoint. This is one of the huge advantages of using CSS Grid. All of a sudden, a lot of the stuff that used to be colossally complicated becomes almost absurdly simple because we're working with grids and we can place whatever we want inside the grids and we can position the grids anywhere we want relative to the viewport. It's almost like magic. To wrap up this chapter, I want to give you a little bonus to improve the user experience of both of these sliding menus we've created. You will have noticed I keep referring to them as sliding menus, but when you click on the button, it pretty much just slams into place. There is no sliding here. It's like pop on and pop off, which works, but it's really jarring, not very attractive, and it almost looks like an error. What will be better is if the menu slid into view from the left-hand side and then slid out again when it was deactivated, and we can do that using CSS. But there's a caveat. As of this recording, there's a bug in Firefox that prevents this from working properly in Firefox. So if you are going to do this in production and Firefox has not resolved this issue by the time you watch it, you need to make some changes to the code to get it to work across all browsers, and that means making some compromises. I'll show you what that is a little later on. But first, let's just assume all browsers are working the way they're supposed to and see what happens if we transition the menus in and out. Like I said, this is done using CSS, and really all we have to do is go into the element that we want to transition. So in this case, the site element and the trigger button. Go to the bottom and say transition, the property we want to transition, which is left, and then how long the transition should take, 0.6 seconds. So that's the site element. Scrolling down, I'll find my trigger, that's the button. Same thing, transition, left, 0.6s. Save that. And here I'm going to go to Chrome and show you how it works. So when I click on the menu button, the menu appears on the left-hand side. I click on it again. It slides out of view. Now, this is a really nice effect, but there's a slight little weird thing that's happening here. And it's a little hard to catch the first time, but look closely. When I click the menu button, menu slides into view. Now, look at the actual menu items here when I click the button again. Do you notice how they disappeared first and then the menu area slid out of view? Well, that's because we're currently hiding these pieces of content using the same rule that applies to the whole element, so the items are immediately hidden before the menu is transitioned off canvas. We can get around this problem by changing our CSS a little bit and then using the transition end event in the browser with JavaScript to append a separate class to just the menu element, and then hide and show the menu element only when the transition has actually ended. The first thing we need to do is change the behavior of this main nav UL reveal state. So right now, the menu is hidden by default, and then it's revealed using this reveal main nav UL. This section here is the culprit for our weird menu behavior. When the reveal class is added to the site element, everything slides into view, and we reveal the main nav UL by setting its property to display flex. However, when the reveal class is removed, so the menu starts to slide off screen, it immediately defaults back to display none, and thus the menu items disappear. So we can't use the reveal class to hide and show the menu items. Instead, we have to create a new class, so I'll call that one open. And I'll actually append it to the main nav element. So now if the open class is appended to the UL, then we display the UL elements as flex. Otherwise, we display them as none. Next, I need to change my JavaScript to make this happen. So if you look here, we have a constant with the name reveal that points at the main nav. What I want to happen is when the menu is revealed, in addition to adding the reveal class to the site element, I also want to grab this reveal, which is main nav, and say class list add, and add the open class. That will cause the menu UL to appear. Now, because I use the add method here, I also need to use the remove method somewhere else, and I'll do that in a new function. So I'll create a new function called remove menu. Inside the function, I first check if trigger get attribute, then I look for the aria expanded attribute, and I check to make sure it's set to false, meaning the menu is currently not expanded. That is after the transition. If that's the case, then I'll grab reveal, class list, remove, open. So if the aria expanded argument on the trigger button is set to false, I remove the open class from main nav. Then I'll create an event listener all the way here at the bottom, targeting site, add event listener. Here I'm looking for transition end. And when that event happens, I run remove menu, save this, go back in Chrome, and now when I click on the menu button, menu slides out and we can see the menu items. When I click on it again, the panel slides out and you could see the menu items sliding out with it if you look closely. But if I now tab through, you'll see I'm tabbing directly to the first item in the main content. So the menu items are not currently available. I have to open the menu to get to the menu items. And this is where we run into problems with Firefox. Watch what happens in Firefox. I go to the menu and I open it. The menu items are now present in the DOM and available to me, but you can't see them. So if I tab, I'm actually tabbing through the menu items, and eventually the menu closes. Now you'll notice when I click the menu button again, the menu will appear for a short time underneath and it'll do some weird stuff here. And then it disappears. So this is not working the way it's supposed to. To get around this problem in Firefox, you would have to go into main styles here and find main nav UL and take away position fixed. If you do that and go back to Firefox, you'll see now everything works the way it's expected to. But the menu is now no longer fixed, which means you can only access it if you're at the top. So that is the compromise I was talking about. Now, hopefully, this will be resolved in Firefox and this bug goes away before you watch this course. If not, you have to decide what is more important, animation or a sticky menu. It's entirely up to you.